Chapter 676. Fan Xian looked calmly at Yun Jilan in front of him. Unexpectedly, he thought of the situation many years ago when he first saw this great swordsman in Jingdo's night palace. At that time he was just a young man who had just stepped onto the political stage of the three countries. The first disciple of the sword hut, Yun Jilan, was already famous throughout the world. He was the true leader of the Dongyi diplomatic group. 6 years had passed. Fan Xian had already become one of the most powerful people in the world. Yun Jilan even had to kneel in front of him and express his loyalty to him. Things had changed with time. It made one sigh with emotion. Fan Xian didn't know what Sigu Jian had set up before his death or how he had convinced Yun Jilan, who was a die-hard member of the faction, but he could sense that Yun Jilan's attitude was not overly pretentious. He understood these warriors who endlessly pursued martial arts. Once they decided on something, it was difficult to go back on it. He had heard Yun Jilan's words clearly. He had heard the words 12 swords. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. Calmly he looked at him and said, 12 swords. Royun, this heart of the sword is not here. How can I control these 12 swords? Without waiting for Yun Jilan to reply, he had already stood up and solemnly helped the first disciple of the sword hut up. Sincerely he said, I know you will not believe me because of the sword saint's last words. I also don't need you to believe me. However, if this is a deal, I need the sword hut's power and the sword hut needs my protection. If you are not here, how can I hold these 12 swords tightly? There was no smile on Yun Jilan's face. Indifferently he said, my teacher has prepared a way to reassure Sir Fan Jr. After saying this, Yun Jilan turned and left, not giving Fan Xian any chance to exchange feelings or draw his heart of the sword to his side. Fan Xian stood in the room as if he had lost something. He thought about what Sigu Jian had arranged for Yun Jilan. In a moment he guessed one thing. Although Sigu Jian wanted to place a large bet on him, he still needed someone to keep him in check, watch and supervise him. Yun Jilan was the person who drifted away from the alliance of interest. Given his prestige in the hearts of the disciples of the sword hut, if Fan Xian's future actions harmed the interests of Dongyi too much, with one order, of the 12 swords Fan Xian had in name, there would probably be only one pitiful and lonely sword left in an instant. The second disciple of the sword hut entered the room after Yun Jilan. Fan Xian looked calmly at the middle-aged man and found that his appearance was very ordinary. There was not a trace of anything outstanding between his brows. Even the sword intent on his body was deeply hidden. Wearing a slightly thick cotton robe, he did not look like a powerful swordsman. Rather, he looked more like a housekeeper. After the eldest disciple brother arrived, it was the second disciple brother. Fan Xian smiled bitterly in his heart. Sigu Jian's arrival had directly pushed him into the fire pit. The disciples of the sword hut seemed to have accepted his will and took turns reporting to him. Out of the corner of his eye, Fan Xian glanced at the brown urn beside him. A sense of loss appeared in his eyes. A sword saint had become a jar of ash beside his hand. His hand gently stroked the urn. It was as if he could still feel the warmth of Sigu Jian's ashes. Following the movement of his fingers, the gaze of the housekeeper-like second brother also changed. He immediately calmed down. He waved his hand and a few third-generation disciples of the sword hut carried in a few boxes. Fan Xian raised his head and asked with a slight smile, is this the sword saint's legacy? The second disciple brother smiled and didn't say anything. It was not until all of the boxes had been placed in Fan Xian's room that he quietly said, of course, the property of the sword hut would not be this small. These are just some temporary businesses that can be used. Teacher said you needed silver right now, so I brought it over for you. There are also some accounts that I thought you would be interested in, so I brought them over on my own. Fan Xian was slightly surprised and quietly looked at this housekeeper-like sword hut ace. He would not underestimate this second disciple brother. On the contrary, of the 13 disciples of the sword hut, he had always thought that this second disciple brother was worth paying attention to. Putting aside the fact that this second disciple brother had been able to remain neutral during the internal conflict between Yun Jilan and 13th Wang and not be implicated, and that Sigu Jian had him stand guard outside the sword hut, it was clear that this person was deeply trusted by Sigu Jian. Silver accounts? Fan Xian looked at him with narrowed eyes and asked, thank you for your trouble. I still don't know what these accounts have to do with. The second disciple of the sword hut said evenly, it has to do with Taiping Money House. Hearing these words, Fan Xian could no longer sit calmly on the low couch. Abruptly rising, he stared at the second disciple and didn't speak for a moment. In the end he couldn't resist laughing self-mockingly. In an admiring tone he said, Unexpectedly, I don't think anyone would have thought that the owner of the largest money house in the world would be a warrior hidden in the sword hut. Taiping Money House, the largest money house in the world. Back then, the Ming family of the Qing kingdom had such an enormous property. To a certain extent, it had to rely on the support of Taiping Money House's cash flow. Ever since this money house appeared in the world, it had been the largest and most reputable money house in the world, bar none. Furthermore, in decades, no other money house had been able to threaten its position. Even a few years ago, when Fan Xian and the Northern Qi Emperor secretly joined hands and used the old Ministry of Revenue officials his father had sent to manage it, they had created an abnormally large Zhaoshang money house. In front of Taiping Money House, it was still like an underdeveloped child. Fan Xian, who held the right to produce and sell the palace treasury, 2 smuggling channels, a brothel alliance and a large-scale money house, was without question the richest person in the world. He knew that although he had a lot of silver in his hands, compared to Taiping Money House, it was still not enough. This was because this Taiping Money House was deeply rooted in the commerce of the continent. All of the large merchants had deep connections with it. If the Taiping Money House truly exerted its power, the amount of silver it could move could reach an astonishing level. Fan Xian was not a normal powerful official. He had the business and social economy of his previous life. In this life he also had dealings with merchants. Thus, he knew better than most people the terrifying power of Taiping Money House, as well as the use it could bring to bear. In the past, he had once had the Overwatch Council investigate the secrets of Taiping Money House. However, every time they reached a certain location, the clues would come to an abrupt end. Since the largest money house in the world had its beginnings in Dongyi, it had a connection to the sword hut. At least, it had to have Sigu Jian's support. However, Fan Xian had never thought that the largest Taiping money house in the world was itself the property of the sword hut. The master of Taiping Money House was the second disciple of the sword hut. Fan Xian looked in a daze at the master of Taiping Money House. Endless complicated emotions welled up in his heart. Only now did he know how much Sigu Jian had bet before his death and how much power he had added to himself. The 12 swords were terrifying. The control of Dongyi was terrifying. What was truly terrifying was probably the boxes of accounts that had been sent into the room. The accounts of Taiping Money House. Fan Xian took a deep breath and bowed respectfully to the second disciple of the sword hut. Evenly he asked, "I still don't know your name." This respect was not for his identity as a disciple of the sword hut and his 9th-level ace realm. Rather, it was for his position as the master of Taiping Money House. In this world, what was most worthy of respect was power. The person who controlled half of the money in the world was, without question, the most worthy of respect. At least this was what Fan Xian thought. Li Bohua, the second disciple of the sword hut, the master of Taiping Money House, was not surprised by Fan Xian's attitude. Warmly he said, "I've been in charge of Taiping Money House for 16 years. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He didn't know what kind of attitude he should use to speak to this person. Based on Sigu Jian's intentions, this person should be of use to him. However, this was a major figure who owned Taiping Money House. Could he truly be of use to him? Immediately after, he thought of something else. His pupils gradually constricted. Using the power in his hands, Zhaoshang Money House and Taiping Money House, which faintly controlled the livelihood of countless merchants and commoners, such power should be able to oppose something. This was a bottom-up confrontation. Li Bohua looked at Fan Xian's expression and knew what he was thinking. Slowly he said, "Taiping Money House lends to the world. If the situation is difficult, I'm afraid it will not be able to collect those loans." But the book came out. Fan Xian looked at him and waited for his next words. Banknotes fly all over the world, but the root of the money is always within Dongyi. Li Bohua did not hide anything in front of Fan Xian. If Sir Fan Jr. can gather these powers together, it can indeed affect many things. If you want the world to fall into chaos, it is not a difficult matter. Only those with power spoke with confidence. Only now did Fan Xian know that of the 13 disciples of the sword hut, the most powerful person was not Yun Jilan, who had the most prestige, nor was it 13th Wang who had the most limitless potential. Rather, it was Li Bohua who held the most silver. This is a large gift. Fan Xian had already calmed down from his earlier shock. Slowly he said, "If Dongyi's demands are too much and I am still unable to do it, I must explain ahead of time. This is already your property, sir." Li Bohua looked at him with a not-quite-there smile. Unlike other martial aces, this hidden oligarch of the land's business world immediately saw Fan Xian's cautiousness. Evenly he said, "Teacher did not ask you to do anything in his last will. Presumably you have already discussed it. I'm just carrying it out. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said self-mockingly, in my life, I have already been hit by a golden basin that fell from the heavens. Am I going to be hit a second time today? I don't know what you need silver for, but I have silver. Li Bohua was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, of course personally I would like to raise a condition. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. A moment later he said, you have the right and power to raise any condition. Li Bohua slowly rose and said, Taiping Money House was first the property of the master of Dongyi's manor. Later it became the private property of the Sword Hut. I have spent a total of 16 years in it, and the money house has grown larger and larger. Please remember the money house is silver. It is not just the money house's silver. There is also the silver of all the merchants in Dongyi and even the silver of countless people in northern Qi and the Qing kingdom. If you want to use it, there must be a limit. You can't dig up all the merchants' silver. Of course. What I mean is, Taiping Money House is, in reality, the money house of the Dongyi people. It is their money, their root. Li Bohua looked at him calmly and said each word clearly. You only have half Dongyi blood. I want to remind you that our allegiance is only in name. We do not want to become Yanjing people, Jiangnan people, or Weizhou people. We only want to be Dongyi people. Speak frankly. Fan Xian looked at him with narrowed eyes. We cannot station troops, Li Bohua furrowed his brows and said quietly. With these words, the corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched into a smile. Looking at him, he quietly said, you are a smart person. Of course, you know that this is something the Sword Saint has already approved of. I cannot give in. Immediately after, he furrowed his brows and said, you also have to understand me. I have already done my best to convince the millions of people in the Qing kingdom. Li Bohua also smiled. What he said earlier was only a method of negotiation. He was sincerely stating his true request. If we must station troops, I hope it is the Black Knights. Li Bohua looked at Fan Xian and calmly said. Nothing else. Fan Xian shook his head. There are only 1,000 Black Knights in total. Furthermore, the emperor will not agree. Then it would be the great prince's old subordinates. It would be best if the great prince came personally. Li Bohua also did not give in. Presently there are already strange movements in the various vassal states. The hearts of the people are also beginning to fall into chaos. After the funeral, if the Qing army forcefully enters, it will probably cause a great deal of backlash. The situation will become chaotic. How will this problem be resolved? Would there not be this problem if the Black Knights or the original Western Expedition Army entered Dongyi? Li Bohua smiled slightly. The master of the Black Knights is you, and the master of the Western Expedition Army is the Great Prince. All of the people of Dongyi know that you are a descendant of the young lady of the Yi family and the Great Prince is Aunt Ning's son. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know what crucial effect this had on the stability of Dongyi's situation. It depends on the hearts of the people, Li Bohua said quietly. Li Bohua quietly said, in these 20 years, Dongyi has produced 2 famous women. One is your mother. Even today, the merchants of Dongyi still see the old Yi family as the pride of Dongyi. The other is Aunt Ning, a pitiful female prisoner of war in Dongyi. In the end, she became the imperial concubine of a foreign country. Perhaps you find it strange, but in reality the people of Dongyi have never thought of this as a humiliation. They only think of it as a rare honor. Fan Xian was silent. Naturally, he thought of the Chinese girls in his previous life who had become the imperial concubines of Northern Europe and the wives of great riches. It seemed that at that time, people's emotions were not conflicted. On the contrary, there was a secret joy. It had nothing to do with worshipping foreign things. It was probably a strange joy of announcing one's country's charm to the outside world. It is because the position of the young lady of the Yi family and Aunt Ning in the hearts of the Dongyi people has never changed. Li Bohua looked at him and said, thus, in the hearts of many merchants and common people, you or the Great Prince are actually half Dongyi people. If one of you were to station troops here, it would be easier to calm the emotions of the people. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, what you say makes sense. I can try to convince the emperor with these words. Presumably, the emperor also wants a complete Dongyi and not a city with volunteer armies rising from all sides and rivers of blood. Thank you for your trouble. After Li Bohua said this, he bowed deeply and prepared to leave. As for the specifics of Dongyi becoming a subject, such as whether it would be a yearly tribute or directly incorporated into Jingdo's tax system, they were still being discussed by various levels of officials. Above these matters was, of course, the most important matter of stationing troops. Li Bohua had come freely with Taiping Money House and left freely with the chests. This made the burden on Fan Xian's shoulders even heavier. Please wait a moment. Fan Xian suddenly asked for his guest to stay. The shock in his heart could not be completely dispelled. He truly did not understand why Sigu Jian had decided to gamble so heavily on him before his death, while the disciples of the Sword Hut did not ask for details or reason. Instead, they had bravely and even recklessly brought out Dongyi's wealth. They were not like Sigu Jian, who knew the past and the deep chasm that was difficult to bridge between Fan Xian and the emperor. Why did they trust Fan Xian? We just trust in teacher's intelligence. Li Bohua gazed at him and smiled slightly. Presumably, you know that teacher has never been an idiot. Fan Xian was silent. He then smiled and said, presumably you have invested so much, so you have to have some way of monitoring me. Of course it is not Yin Jilan. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and thought. The manor of the master of the city is going to be rebuilt. Yin Jilan is the best choice. He is outside the Sword Hut and watches coldly from the sidelines. He will keep me in check from the bigger picture. But where are your checks on me personally? You should know that I am not someone who can be controlled. We have no confidence in being able to control Sir Fan Jr., Li Bohua said calmly. Thus, we are only following teacher to carry out a grand gamble. Of course, if Sir Fan Jr. goes back on his word and swallows Dongyi into his belly, it would not be out of our expectations. After all, you are a Qing person and the illegitimate child of the Qing emperor. The life and death of Dongyi is presumably not that important in your heart. Since you have thought of this, why do you still dare to gamble? Dongyi doesn't have any other power. We only have money and swords. Li Bohua smiled slightly and bowed before walking out of the quiet room. Then a sword walked into the quiet room. The tired 13th Wang's face was pale. He looked at Fan Xian and was silent for a long time. In a very low voice he said, from now on, I will follow you every day. If you go back on your word, I will kill you. Can you kill me? Fan Xian sighed and shook his head. Chapter 677. Fan Xian wanted to smile but he couldn't. The expression on his face was like it had been frozen by the wind and snow outside the temple. He stared in a daze at 13th Wang in front of him. He looked at his young friend's calm but stubborn face. After a long time, he sighed deeply and also felt the chill in the depths of his heart. He knew 13th Wang was speaking the truth. He was an honest person, which was why he felt a chill. If the development of the situation was different from what Fan Xian and Sigu Jian had predicted, if in the eyes of the people of the world, Fan Xian had only taken Dongyi's power and had not considered the interests of the people and merchants of Dongyi, perhaps 13th Wang would actually attack him at all costs. Sigu Jian's final order, Taiping Money House, and the disciples of the Sword Hut had already given up too much profit and power for this gamble. If Fan Xian truly went back on his word, these people would hate him to the bone. Without even thinking, Fan Xian knew how shocking the vengeance of the 13 disciples of the Sword Hut would be. Furthermore, he had this close young friend at his side. Fan Xian did not wish to fight to the death with 13th Wang. Even if the Sword Hut's vengeance could not directly harm Fan Xian, who was protected by the Overwatch Council, the sudden attack of such a 9th-level ace would certainly harm the family, friends, and subordinates Fan Xian cared about. The Qing Emperor could bear such a loss because, most of the time, he did not see most of his family and subordinates as human beings. However, Fan Xian could not. He knew that 13th Wang's current attitude represented the determination of the disciples of the Sword Hut. He couldn't help but feel secretly wary. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. A cold light gradually grew in them before gradually dissipating. Looking at 13th Wang, he calmly said, "Your brothers have to be clear about one thing. It was your teacher who begged me to do this. I did not beg him to do it. This so-called cooperation is your one-sided idea. I will not accept any form of threat." 13th Wang was silent. He knew Fan Xian was speaking the truth. Fan Xian stared into his eyes and said each word clearly, "This is something I have always wondered about. Sigu Jian gave me 12 swords. How exactly can I trust your loyalty and not have to worry every night that you will stab me in the back? If someone wants to stab you, I will stop them." 13th Wang lowered his head sadly. "As long as you don't go back on your word." Fan Xian smiled coldly and mockingly. "I have the shadow behind me. What do I need you to do? I just hate this feeling. Who am I? I'm not someone who can be coerced into doing things. The Sword Hut must correct its attitude. If Yun Jilan or Li Bohua do not believe me, then there is no need for us to continue talking. Let's drop it here. After a few months we can bring the army back to talk." 13th Wang raised his head and glanced at him with some confusion and pain. You are also threatening me. It's impolite not to reciprocate. Fan Xian looked at him seriously and said, I have a headache over the will you have shown. I don't want anyone to use you to control me. We do not have such extravagant hopes, but to be honest, we do not understand teacher's final order, particularly since our brothers have not had much contact with you. They do not know what kind of person you are. They do not believe that you would not care about the interests of the Qin kingdom and think about the survival of Dongyi. Whether they believe it or not is up to them. I only need them to accept it. Fan Xian stood and gently patted his shoulder. We are friends. I don't want you to become a friend who stands by my side and constantly watches my every move. Friends should trust each other and support each other without asking for reasons. Fan Xian looked at 13th Wang and said seriously. You are the attitude Sigu Jian showed me, and it is also the attitude I showed Sigu Jian. Because of you, I was able to build this kind of trust between Sigu Jian and I. I hope that, from now on, you will learn to have your own attitude. People must live for themselves. In this world, there are already enough people who carry the so-called hatred of their countries and families and the righteousness of the common people. Your personality is not suited to doing this kind of thing. You are suited for it? 13th Wang faintly asked after understanding his words. I had no choice. I was forced to do this. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. His heart was sorrowful. The corners of his lips twitched. Gazing outside the quiet room, he sighed and sang, Look at that dark hole. Is that the thieves' nest? Why do I recognize them as thieves? But are they real thieves? Am I a thief? I don't want to go forward and I don't want to kill them all. 13th Wang looked at him calmly and suddenly said, In this world, who can force you to do this? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, I don't know. Perhaps, fundamentally speaking, it is just me who wants to do this. Concerning the emperor's matter, Fan Xian had already thought deeply enough. Just as he had said to his father before Uncle Wu Zhu returned, he did not want to have a falling out with the emperor. Furthermore, he did not have any reason to do so. Although there had been a tragedy decades ago, as a soul drifting through this world, even if he wanted to avenge that woman, he would still hesitate when faced with his fleshly father. Furthermore, the emperor was still so powerful that he could not be defeated. Fan Xian only wanted to make this world more gentle and more in line with his thoughts. This was probably the first thing all transmigrators wanted to do after arriving in a completely different world. He didn't know that Yi Tao had done this, Wu Anghua had done this, and even Yi Qingmei had done this. Probably only Sure You hadn't done this. In reality, this was just the fate of transmigrators, or rather, the fate of outstanding transmigrators. One could not be a foppish playboy for a lifetime. Enjoyment could not quell one's spiritual needs. The human's instinctive desire for knowledge and control would force one to walk in that direction. Anyone with enough power and influence would try to use the power in their hands to change something. To wear embroidered clothes and walk through the night for a lifetime required the willpower of an old monk. Even an old monk on the verge of death couldn't resist asking Shakespeare. For a person like Fan Xian, when he already had a certain position in this world, he always had to put on beautiful clothes, stand under the sunlight, and do the things he wanted to do according to his own thoughts. For this world, it was not necessarily a good choice. At least it was a choice he thought was good. History was a dough for the powerful to knead. However, the powerful thought it was best to knead it into a delicate little girl. Some thought it should be kneaded into a large knife to chop around in a bustling market. As for who was right and who was wrong, it would be left to history to judge. In any case, before history came to a conclusion, the powerful would have long become white bones. They had to do it. Only then would it be thorough, straightforward, and not wronged. Fan Xian lived his second life. At the end of the spring of the 10th year of the Qin calendar, he finally climbed to the peak he could reach. At this time he was a young and powerful official of the Qin kingdom. He had power in his hands, great power in the Overwatch Council, and money. Most of the money in the world was faintly under his control. Furthermore, he had a reputation. His reputation was so resounding that there was no second person in the world. Most importantly, he had deeds. When white smoke rose around Dongyi and white spirit summoning banners fluttered in the thick spring wind, Sigu Jian's funeral was about to begin. The negotiations between the Qin kingdom and Dongyi had already ended. The situation in the world had finally undergone a fundamental change. From now on, the appearance of the territories became unfamiliar. Dongyi finally submitted to the powerful Qin kingdom in name. Other than a smear of green in the west and the country in the north that had maintained its silence, the entire land had submitted to the Qin kingdom's iron hooves. Furthermore, the Qing kingdom had not sent a single soldier to achieve this goal. The person who had facilitated all of this was, of course, Fan Xian. His reputation at this moment reached the peak of history. What he had done would certainly be written into the books of history. Fan Xian stood calmly in front of the door of the sword hut with 13th Wang behind him. The other 11 disciples of the sword hut also stood quietly not far away. The Qing diplomatic group stood on his other side. The secret agents and swordsmen of the Overwatch Council did not reveal themselves. They were warily watching everything around them from various directions. Today was the opening ceremony of the sword hut in the 10th year of the Qing calendar. Originally, this ceremony had already been held a long time ago. Sigu Jian had been seriously ill and on the verge of death. Additionally, the sword hut had something important to announce to the world and had invited many important figures. There were too many people and too many people. Recently, there had been a faint element of unease brewing in the small vassal states around Dongyi and in some of the streets in the city. Volunteer armies had even appeared in a few places. As the representative of the invaders, Fan Xian became the most important person to protect. However, Dongyi was not worried about Fan Xian's safety. The person who wanted to kill Fan Xian in this place should not have been born yet. Of course, this judgment excluded the only great grandmaster in the world, the Qing Emperor. After all, everyone thought that the Qing Emperor would not suddenly come in a frenzy to assassinate his illegitimate child, who had just accomplished a great deed. No one dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with Fan Xian. The weather was bright and beautiful. The sun shone brightly, giving rise to a faint summer heat. 13th Wang was the person closest to Fan Xian. He was half a step behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian's expression was calm as he welcomed the large merchants who had come from all over the world. At the same time as half a master, he received the Qing and Northern Qi diplomatic groups. The faces of the Qing diplomatic group carried a joy that was difficult to suppress. However, the expressions of the Northern Qi officials were very ugly. A large canopy had already been erected in the open space in front of the sword hut. Countless white paper flowers and curtains hung on it. It did not look festive. It was at odds with the opening ceremony and the declaration of allegiance in name. Fan Xian did not care about this. The officials of the Qing Ministry of Rites were displeased, but they didn't show anything. Everyone knew that the opening ceremony this time could be considered Sigu Jian's funeral. The officials of the Ministry of Rites did not want to anger the powerful people in the sword hut at such an important time. The sun slowly moved up into the sky. The air gradually grew hot. Fortunately, Dongyi was on the shores of the East Sea. With the sea wind blowing endlessly day and night, it was bearable. Additionally, the canopy blocked out most of the blazing sunlight. Other than wiping away sweat, the guests who had come to watch the ceremony did not complain much. Suddenly, the sound of firecrackers rang out outside the sword hut. Countless firecrackers exploded at this moment. The paper shreds were sent flying high into the air. Smoke began to fill the air. As if this was a signal, firecrackers that had been prepared a long time ago lit up at the same time in front of every shop and private residence in Dongyi. Even the brothels that usually hung red lanterns and sang incessantly all night changed their lanterns to white and set off firecrackers in front of the buildings. The girls had already changed into plain clothes. With a glimmer of unease and confusion, they looked in the direction of the sword hut. The merchants and commoners stood under the white spirit-summoning banners in front of their doors and watched as the firecrackers exploded into pieces in front of them. The baby in the woman's arms was startled awake by the loud and clear firecrackers that rang out from all directions in Dongyi. He wailed loudly. All of Dongyi was filled with the sound of firecrackers and the sound of crying. The slightly blinding smell of glass enveloped the entire city along with the smoke. The shattering of the firecrackers was like a person's life. The rising smoke was like a gradually departing soul. Fan Xian watched this scene calmly and suddenly thought of the firecrackers he had heard outside Shangjing in northern Qi many years ago. He thought to himself, regardless of whether it was Master Zhuang or Sigu Jian, they were both equally noble to these common people. Under the canopy outside the sword hut, at Yun Jilan's voice, everyone knelt down toward the large black coffin. Fan Xian also knelt down. He then heard Yun Jilan announce Sigu Jian's final order on his behalf. As expected, before Sigu Jian died, he finally forgave Yun Jilan's disloyalty and ordered him to take over the position of Master of Dongyi. Yun Jilan had always been in charge of the mundane affairs of the sword hut and was well versed in worldly affairs. Given the dissatisfaction in his heart, he would certainly be able to form a relatively complete restriction with the Qing people who had come to take over Dongyi. Fan Xian did not care about this. He listened silently. He only thought that only if Sigu Jian passed the sword hut to 13th Wang would he be able to use the close relationship between the two of them to truly control those 12 terrifying swords. As he thought this, he heard Yun Jilan's last words. Involuntarily, his eyes narrowed. Fan Xian's mother is from Dongyi. I have personally taught him sword techniques. He is a great talent. I order him to preside over the opening of the sword hut. Chapter 678. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. His pupils constricted slightly. He then stood up in front of the large shed. Straightening his back, he calmly looked at Yun Jilan, who was singing loudly. Everyone around the sword hut was kneeling. Even the members of the Qing diplomatic group knelt in front of the great Grandmaster Sigu Jian's coffin and bowed sincerely. Before they came, the Qing emperor had personally approved this minute etiquette. No one had any problems. Fan Xian rose and appeared particularly eye-catching. Of the thousands of people inside and outside, only he and Yun Jilan stood in front of the large black coffin. Fan Xian did not want to kneel to anyone in his life. Other than heaven and earth, his parents, he was not in a good mood even when he went to court and knelt to the emperor. He was willing to kneel with all his heart because he respected the strong and respected the dead. However, Yun Jilan's last words shocked him. It also completely turned the faint respect he had for Sigu Jian into a faint anger. Everyone heard Yun Jilan's last words clearly. These were the words the 13 disciples of the sword hut heard at the same time as they knelt in front of the bed. Yun Jilan would not lie and did not dare to lie. Thus, everyone turned their gaze toward Sir Fan Jr., who had already abruptly stood up. Mother from Dongyi? Personally teaching sword skills? Truly talented? Hosting the opening of the hut? Countless shocked, puzzled, and amused gazes landed on Fan Xian's body, but they did not make his clothes flutter. He only looked calmly at Yun Jilan as if trying to determine if he had imagined these words or if they were something else. These simple words revealed 4 pieces of information that Sigu Jian wanted to announce to the world. Fan Xian's mother was Yi Qingmei. Although Yi Qingmei had helped the Qing kingdom rise to prominence, she could still be considered a person of Dongyi. This was not a secret. As for the matter of personally teaching sword techniques, since Sigu Jian had said so in his last words, everyone believed it. A great grandmaster had the right to teach Sir Fan Jr. the true meaning of the Sigu sword. As for the evaluation of being a great talent, everyone thought Sir Fan Jr. was worthy of it. The problem was that these messages all faintly revealed a kind of feeling. It was a feeling of intimacy, a feeling of wanting to pull Fan Xian toward Dongyi. The maternal relationship referred to the closeness of blood. Teaching the sword was the relationship between master and disciple. Datsai was Dongyi's approval of Fan Xian. As for having Fan Xian host the opening ceremony, that was the most important thing. The sword hut had appeared in the world for decades. It had only been 20 years since the sword hut had truly opened and accepted disciples. Each time, the person hosting the opening ceremony was none other than Sigu Jian himself. Other than the 3 years when he was heavily injured and waiting for death, Sigu Jian paid particular attention to the opening ceremony of the sword hut. This created a tacit agreement in the world. Anyone who presided over the opening of the sword hut was the master of the sword hut. Sigu Jian's last words had appointed Fan Xian to open the sword hut. Naturally, he had given him this sword hut, which contained countless aces and 3 generations of disciples. This was indeed something Fan Xian had not thought of. During these 2 days, he had been thinking about how he could truly make the 12 swords other than Yun Jilan work for him. 13th Wang didn't need to think about it. He had already seen through this young man's personality. What about the other aces of the sword hut? Unexpectedly, Sigu Jian had thought of this problem for him ahead of time and solved it. However, the method of solving this problem stunned Fan Xian. 3 pieces of information and 1 final order. The sword hut was in his hands. From now on, his words would be the same as Sigu Jian's words in the past. A mountain was now in his hands. It seemed to be a wonderful thing, but Fan Xian knew that behind the beauty was Sigu Jian's hidden ruthlessness. This was a needle stuck between Fan Xian and the emperor. As a Qing official, he had become the master of the sword hut. What would the emperor think? No matter how much the emperor trusted Fan Xian, could he watch as the power in Fan Xian's hands grew in the light? Particularly when Dongyi appeared to be so close and loyal to Fan Xian. Even if the emperor's heart was like the ocean, his confidence was like the sun and moon, and he didn't care about anything. What about his emotions? People were animals controlled by their emotions. The emperor would certainly not like his illegitimate child to shine too brightly, perhaps even brighter than himself. There could only ever be one sun in the sky. Fan Xian stared at Yun Jilan's lips. Only now did he know that before Sigu Jian died, he had still played a trick on him and dug a hole for him to jump into. It was like Yun Jilan did not notice his gaze at all. Naturally and calmly, he finished all of Sigu Jian's last words. He then walked in front of Fan Xian and bowed respectfully. Please. Please what? Please take the seat of honor? Please and then please? A cold smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. He unconsciously glanced down from the corner of his eyes. Everyone present had already risen. They were still staring at everything happening in front of the black coffin with stunned expressions. Fan Xian glanced at the officials of the diplomatic group, particularly the assistant minister of the Board of Rights. The assistant minister sensed his gaze and furrowed his brows in thought for a long time. He then slowly nodded his head. The exchange of thoughts between the two men in the Qing diplomatic group ended here. The assistant minister of the Board of Rights knew what Sir Fan Jr. was worried about. However, seeing that Dong Yi was about to submit, he didn't want this matter to affect the bigger picture. The Qing people's desire to expand their territory was too strong. This assistant minister thought that the emperor would not be angry because Sir Fan Jr. had accepted the position of master of the sword hut without permission. Fan Xian thought silently for a long time. He evaluated the pros and cons of this matter in his mind, particularly guessing how the emperor would react once he learned of this matter. Yun Jilan was not in a hurry. He looked at him with a glimmer of mockery and waited for his response. Fan Xian knew what he was mocking. It was just as his father had said. His behavior had indeed been a bit hesitant and not very straightforward. However, these people did not know that those who wanted to do great things had to be careful, especially when faced with the unfathomable emperor. In the end, Fan Xian took a deep breath and said with a slight smile, I didn't think that even in death your teacher would still not let me go. Since I am going to help Sir Fan Jr. achieve a great deed, the disciples of the sword hut must throw themselves under your banner. Yun Jilan seemed to not hear the sharpness in his words. It is getting late. Please accept the sword and then go to open the sword hut. Fan Xian didn't move. Suddenly he asked, after opening the sword hut, the disciples of the third generation will all listen to my orders? Correct. What about you? He looked into Yun Jilan's eyes and smiled slightly. If I told you to dig 36,000 earthworms, would you agree? Digging earthworms was an interesting part of another story in another world. Yun Jilan had never heard of it, but it did not stop him from answering quickly. It was clear that regardless of whether it was the dead Sigu Jian or him, they were both fully prepared for Fan Xian's question. I am now the master of Dong Yi. Since I am an official, I have left the sword hut, Yun Jilan said with a sigh. Yun Jilan sighed, but there was no sense of frustration in his voice. Now I am no longer a member of the sword hut. You cannot control me. So that's how it is. Fan Xian thought to himself that Sigu Jian indeed did not completely trust him. He still wanted to bring the troublesome Yun Jilan out of the picture. He paused for a moment and then returned with a slightly mocking smile. Don't forget, your position as the master of Dong Yi still needs the Qing Emperor's royal title. If the emperor doesn't like you, you won't be able to do it. Yun Jilan's expression didn't change. I think Sir Fan Jr. will let this matter happen. The two of them spoke in very low voices. Standing alone in front of the black coffin, they didn't have to worry about others hearing them. Fan Xian understood that his words were to see if he was willing to cooperate or even form an alliance with the power of Dong Yi or return to his identity as a pure official of the Qing kingdom. This move that had suddenly appeared after Sigu Jian's death had indeed messed up Fan Xian's plans. He had to worry about Jingdo's reaction and the emperor's. Although this move was harsh, it was not something Fan Xian could not accept. At least, it was much better than the situation he had once been incomparably afraid of. He had always been afraid that after Sigu Jian died, he would suddenly order the shadow to take over as the master of the sword hut. If that happened, Sigu Jian would be forcing Fan Xian's faction to directly fall out with the emperor. Although the scene in front of him could create some cracks between Fan Xian and the emperor, Sigu Jian was still rather merciful and gave Fan Xian some time to prepare. Thinking of all the hidden moves this thin and weak great-grandmaster had laid down before his death, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh. He then thought of the hidden moves he had laid down in Shiliang and Jingdo before his death. Only now did he know that the realm of a great grandmaster was not just about martial cultivation. It was also about the affairs of the human heart. Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent for a moment. He then glanced at the assistant minister of the Board of Rights below and nodded slightly. He then gently grasped Yun Jilan's hand. Yun Jilan furrowed his brows slightly. Smile. Since we are acting, we should act beautifully. In the future we will be partners just like the Qing court and Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't look at him. Instead, he raised Yun Jilan's hand with a slight smile. The hands of the second-generation master of the sword hut and the master of Dongyi of an unknown generation clasped tightly in front of Sigu Jian's black coffin and in front of countless spectators. The opening ceremony was not complicated, but it had a sense of sacredness. Fan Xian himself did not have a sacred belief in the sword. When he gently pushed open the tightly closed door of the grass hut, he found that the attitude of the disciples of the sword hut toward him had faintly changed. The respect and cooperation began to have some meaning that came from the heart. Even 13th Wang was no exception. After everything was done, Fan Xian returned to the Qing diplomatic group and entered a quiet room with the assistant minister of the Board of Rights. This was only the opening ceremony and the second round of negotiations. Although the negotiations had gone smoothly, they were still at the final juncture of the merger. Thus, the highest-ranking official the Qing kingdom had sent, other than Fan Xian, was this assistant minister. If they truly wanted to announce to the world that Dongyi belonged to the Qing kingdom, not only the minister of the Board of Rights, but perhaps even the emperor would be interested in coming personally to accept the map and enjoy the worship of the tens of thousands of Dongyi people who had once been citizens of a foreign country. The assistant minister of the Board of Rights looked at Sir Fan Jr. in deep thought and speechless. A moment later he said evenly, "Sir, don't be too troubled. We know what Dongyi is thinking. We are used to it and will defeat it." "Although that is true, it is still not appropriate," Fan Xian sighed and said warmly. "I will have to trouble you to quickly write a memorial and send it back to Jingdo. The emperor must know of this as soon as possible." He couldn't help but say with vexation, "If I hadn't suddenly been forced to do so, logically speaking, there would have to be an edict before I would dare to take over." "The people of Dongyi are still unwilling," the assistant minister said, shaking his head. "However, the emperor is wise. He can certainly see at a glance what these people are trying to do." Fan Xian smiled. He knew that the assistant minister could see his worry. However, the assistant minister did not know what he was thinking in his heart. Of course he wouldn't expose it. Furrowing his brows, he said, "Looks like I will have to return to the capital. Although the negotiations are going smoothly, Dongyi's resistance is still very strong," the assistant minister of the Board of Rights said. "Without you holding down the fort, I'm afraid things will change. Before I came, the emperor had given a strict order that this matter must be completed in one go. I think you should continue to hold down the fort. As for these specific matters, let me return to the capital and report them to the court." Fan Xian had been waiting for these words. After thinking for a moment, he nodded and said, "Thank you for your hard work." There was a stone weighing on Fan Xian's heart. He knew that the identity of the master of the sword hut would not cause the emperor's trust in him to immediately weaken. However, during these years he had done many things that he had overdone. He had always been eating meat from that trust. Who knew when this meat would be eaten up by him? Sigu Jian's move was to prevent Fan Xian from selling Dongyi in the future. He would first sell Dongyi to Fan Xian before anything else. It was better to give it to Fan Xian than to the Qing emperor. If Sigu Jian lost the gamble, this would be the end. No matter how much trouble Fan Xian and the emperor made, what did it have to do with the dead Sigu Jian? Fan Xian once again came to the seaside outside Dongyi. Narrowing his eyes, he sat on a rock and looked at the slowly rising and falling white waves. It was as if he could see Sigu Jian's cold and emotionless eyes inside. "Everyone is forcing me down that path. Have you ever thought that I will have a hard time?" Fan Xian asked as he looked at Sigu Jian in the waves. Sigu Jian seemed to answer with one sentence, "Should I love you and the Qing people?" Fan Xian shook his head. Sigu Jian said, "Whether you have a hard time or not, whether the Qing kingdom is in chaos, what does it have to do with me?" Fan Xian gazed at the waves and said with a smile, "I can have a hard time but I cannot die. Furthermore, the Qing kingdom cannot fall into chaos. I love the Qing kingdom more than your Dongyi. It is our Dongyi. I am a person of the Qing kingdom. You are not a person of the Qing kingdom. You are a person of the world." Fan Xian slowly woke up from his dream. He thought to himself that he was actually not a person of the world, so why did he not want to part with the people of the world? Was the light of idealism his mother had left in this body finally beginning to radiate out? He would do his best and leave the rest to fate. If he could not stop the bloodbath from coming, if he could not change the changes in history, then he would leave this world and live his own life. This was what he should think. Chapter 679. The Dongyi matter was still complicated and sensitive. Suddenly becoming a citizen of the Qing kingdom was not something everyone could accept. Merchants were indeed greedy and prostitutes were heartless. Even the people in the trading houses and brothels found it difficult to immediately change. This was not the same as doing business. Doing it raw and not familiar was to rip off customers. The power to control one's own life and death was best placed in the hands of familiar people. This was not the same as a brothel receiving customers. One red lip for 10,000 to taste? The girls all hoped to be faithful to the end. In particular, the vassal states controlled by Dongyi had long shown signs of unrest. The Song kingdom, which was close to Yanjing, was better off. The nobles and officials of this small country had long become used to the might of the Yanjing army and could not summon any will to resist. Some of the smaller countries that did not border the Qing kingdom thought that they were about to lose the power and luxury they had in name and become a dispensable hostage in Jingdo. Naturally, they began to carry out some things in secret. The power of these small vassal states was not great, so the methods they chose were rather sinister. They secretly stirred up the undercurrents among the people and scattered pepper on the emotions of the Dongyi people. In a short half a month, the resistance movements had become more intense and frequent than a few days ago. All of this was within Fan Xian's expectations. Peacefully taking over Dongyi was not a small matter that could be accomplished overnight. This was the largest matter that had happened in the world in 20 years. The 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already prepared large numbers of civil officials. They entered Dongyi in batches and began to cooperate with the Sword Hut and the manor of the master of the city. They launched wave after wave of propaganda. Adding to the help of the 4th Bureau's spies in various countries and the spies they had bought, as well as Dongyi taking advantage of the situation, propaganda about peace, non-war and mutual prosperity began to spread vigorously. Suppressing the resistance in various places and preventing it from turning into uncontrollable civil unrest required Dongyi to act themselves. Fan Xian did not want the Qing kingdom's national machinery to enter Dongyi too early. Once blood was spilled, the hatred in the hearts of the Dongyi people would deepen, and the situation would become uncontrollable. 3 volunteer armies had already been suppressed. Of course, these volunteer armies were only 100 or so bandits howling through the mountains and forests. Fan Xian had sent 10 of the 12 disciples of the Sword Hut into the forests of these small countries to suppress and explain. As for the results, Fan Xian was still waiting for feedback. Because of the uncertain situation and the natural rebellious nature of the Dongyi people, some of the powerful merchant companies in the city began to feel uneasy. Faced with this trend, Fan Xian joined hands with the second disciple of the Sword Hut, Li Bohua. Using the double pressure of Taiping Money House and Palace Treasury, he directly intimidated all the merchants. At the same time, Fan Xian and the diplomatic mission jointly sent 17 urgent memorials to Jingdo, asking the emperor for instructions on relevant matters. At the same time, he asked in the secret memorials whether the arrangements for the hostages of the vassal states could be lowered to avoid forcing the nobles to act in desperation and do terrible things in their despair. Conquering a territory wasn't something that could be done with just a few words on a piece of paper. The key was to subdue the hearts and wills of the people living in that territory. This would take years, decades, or even centuries. Fan Xian was not in a rush, but he was worried that the emperor would be in too much of a rush. For him, he had to be able to satisfy the emperor and, at the same time, make the people of Dongyi accept it. This was his goal so that the Iron Riders of the Qing kingdom would not kill their way from Yanjing. It was like a steel wire. As he walked on it, the two sides were empty. He had to be careful. Conquering required a propaganda offensive, buying people's hearts, and giving the Dongyi people an excuse to convince themselves. It required Fan Xian to organize everything without sleep or rest. It required him to use his identity as a powerful official of the Qing kingdom and the master of the Sword Hut to meet with various merchants and local figures with real power in Dongyi. He had to give them a definite message and make them feel at ease. This was a very tiring matter. The dark circles under his eyes finally destroyed some of the beauty on Fan Xian's handsome face. His face had also paled. He was extremely tired. Each time he thought of how he was saving hundreds of thousands of lives, this feeling of being able to move closer to the thrill of being a martyr for a just cause made him sober again. Other than everything above, conquering required powerful and irresistible martial power. Only with powerful martial power as the foundation could the people of Dongyi passively and humiliatingly accept their fate of being swallowed up by the Qing kingdom. After the situation in Dongyi calmed slightly, the Qing Iron Riders began to move closer in Dongyi's direction. Like a black cloud crushing a mountain, they were unstoppable. This was also the emperor's bottom line. If the Qing kingdom did not station troops in Dongyi, what kind of conquest was that? It was already the height of summer. The blazing sun shone wildly in the sky, burning Dongi's sorrowful wife into an endless panting of pain. It chased away the dark and rainy weather after the great grandmaster's departure. There was only light. The Northern Qi diplomatic group had long left. What many people found strange was that although the Northern Qi people clearly felt great shock and anger at the Qing kingdom swallowing up Dongi, they did not do anything. Instead, they quietly watched everything happen. It seemed that the Northern Qi people had already accepted their fate. Of the hundreds of people standing outside Dongi, other than the members of the Qing diplomatic group and the officials of the master of the city, there was Fan Xian and the disciples of the Sword Hut who had rushed back from various places. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and stood on the rolling yellow dirt road. Unconsciously, he moved his feet endlessly. His appearance was not very dignified. He also didn't want to put on a dignified appearance. He could clearly feel that the expressions of all the Dongi people waiting outside the city were particularly ugly and pale. There was a special kind of suppressed anger. At this time, Fan Xian would not purposely put on a dignified appearance to provoke them. The ground gradually began to tremble. Yun Jilan's body, standing beside Fan Xian, also gradually began to tremble. Once the first disciple of the Sword Hut and now the master of Dongi, he could no longer control the gloomy emptiness in his heart and began to tremble. The expressions of the officials of the master of the city in Dongi were all very ugly. The faces of the disciples of the Sword Hut were also slightly pale. As their trembling grew louder and louder, they revealed their true emotions. At the end of the road, thunder rumbled faintly, causing the ground to shake. The small grains of sand in the yellow dirt on the ground were shaken and rolled. A rider appeared in their line of sight. Immediately after, 2, 3, 10, 100, 1,000 densely packed riders pressed toward Dongi from the west. A stern and magnificent aura enveloped all the people on the outskirts of the city. The Qing army had arrived. The black mass of riders slowly neared Dongi. They represented the Qing kingdom's powerful military power, the Qing emperor's unstoppable and powerful will, and the desire to conquer. The Qing kingdom had stationed 10,000 Qing soldiers in Dongi. They had been gathered from the armies of the 5 roads within a month. They had been hastily formed, but there was no sign of chaos. These Qing soldiers, who were about to represent the Qing kingdom stationed in Dongi, were all old soldiers of the Western Expedition Army. Under the command of the Great Prince, their battle power was astonishing. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the approaching and threatening Qing army. He smiled slightly mockingly. Tidying his clothes, he slowly walked forward to meet them. He couldn't help but think of the arguments he had with the emperor in the memorials. Sigu Jian's last words had made him spend a great deal of effort to convince the emperor. The emperor knew that if he wanted the people of Dongi to be willing to accept it, the Great Prince and Fan Xian were indeed 2 good choices. There were too few Black Knights, so he could only choose the Great Prince's Western Expedition Army. Fan Xian believed that there were not many generals who truly belonged to the Western Expedition Army among the garrison soldiers. The Great Prince had only come to Dongi to show his face. In the end, he would have to go back. The emperor would not allow his eldest son to be permanently stationed in Dongi. Thinking of the emperor who was far away in Jingdo but was controlling the Dongi matter, Fan Xian's emotions became complicated. Unexpectedly, the emperor was not angry at him for taking over the Sword Hut without an imperial edict. On the contrary, he seemed to know what Fan Xian was worried about. He used an urgent document to send him an imperial edict. The imperial edict was the same as what was written in the box. There were only 2 words. Enji. The Qing emperor was comforting Fan Xian's heart. When Fan Xian thought of this, he couldn't help but feel perplexed. The emperor's trust in him truly moved him. He knew how cold and heartless the emperor could be once he turned hostile. His heart didn't even dare to be moved. Wind and dust gradually rose. Before it was long, it swept down the road toward the city. The speed of the Qing riders gradually increased. Fan Xian involuntarily narrowed his eyes and covered his nose and mouth. He didn't know who had given the order for this intimidating force. He didn't know if it would cause the people of Dongi to feel conflicted. He solemnly turned his head and found that, contrary to his expectations, other than the warriors of the Sword Hut with hidden anger on their faces, the rest of the officials in the manor of the master of the city and the nobles who had come to greet them all showed fear on their faces. Their faces were pale. It was as if they had no intention of resisting. Tens of thousands of riders arrived on the dust with a shocking momentum. It scared most of the people of Dongi to the point of losing their will to resist. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Dongi's bloodthirst was indeed lacking. Although the great prince's move was crude and rude, it hit the other party's weak spot. He didn't know if the emperor had said this before they left. However, for Fan Xian, the lack of bloodthirst in Dongyi was a good thing. He had never hoped that the northern Qi people would be like the Dongyi people and surrender without a fight. It was good to be able to shed as little blood as possible. The hooves of the horses were like thunder. In a moment they had arrived on the outskirts of Dongyi. Tens of thousands of riders wore dark-colored light armor and gave off a piercing light under the sunlight. The dust that had been kicked up gradually settled, revealing the true appearance of the Qing army. The densely packed riders surrounded Dongyi. Silence. It was completely silent. Even the warhorses that were twisting their heads seemed to be intimidated by the Qing army's discipline. They didn't dare paw their hooves or snort. Tens of thousands of cold gazes watched the people from Dongyi who had come to welcome them. The officials, nobles and merchants of Dongyi looked at this scene with fear. They looked at the Qing army's strict discipline, austere aura, superior equipment, and the confidence and tyranny that seeped out from within. Everyone couldn't help but wonder, if the Sword Saint had not given the final edict of surrendering to the Qing kingdom before he left and the Qing army attacked Dongyi, how many days or minutes would Dongyi be able to hold out? Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. A wave of silent horse hooves broke the silence in front of the city gate. The front of the Qing cavalry parted. Their commander walked out from within, as well as the complicated and magnificent ceremonial guards at his side. The Qing emperor's ceremonial guard followed the Qing army and arrived outside Dongyi. The commander-in-chief stood beside the emperor's ceremonial staff. He wore a silver light armor, a sword at his waist and a spear at his side. Behind him was a blood-red cloak that fluttered in the yellow dust-sea breeze. The great prince gently pulled on the reins of his horse and escorted the emperor's ceremonial guard to the front of the crowd. Calmly and with a complicated gaze, he looked at everyone outside the Dongyi city gate. There was a soundless silence. Yun Jilan closed his eyes and was silent for a long time. After struggling for a long time, his eyes gradually grew wet. Then he slowly knelt down toward the emperor's ceremonial guard beside the warhorse. The master of Dongyi knelt. All of the officials quickly followed suit. The nobles of the various vassal states also knelt down. They knelt densely on the ground, expressing their submission to the Qing army and the Qing emperor. The disciples of the Sword Hut did not kneel. They knew this was a helpless decision their teacher had made before his death. Although they knew that their eldest brother-disciple had already broken out of the hut and could only kneel in front of the Qing army for the people of Dongyi, they were not Dongyi officials. They were free people. More accurately, they were Jianghu people. The Jianghu people had their own way of doing things. They did not have any restraints. Thus, they stared at the Qing riders with an astonishing aura that filled the mountains and plains. There was not a glimmer of fear in their eyes. On the contrary, they felt boundless anger and fighting spirit. More than half of the 9th-level aces in the world were there. They were not afraid of anything. The great prince sat on his horse and glanced coldly at the stubborn disciples of the Sword Hut who refused to bow down. He was about to open his mouth to say something when he heard a familiar, clear, slightly tired, and indifferent voice coming from the side. "Disciples of the Sword Hut, listen up." Fan Xian closed his eyes slightly and said, "Return to the city to help the manor of the master of the city maintain law and order." This reason was absurd. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew he had made a mistake. He shouldn't have let the disciples of the Sword Hut come. These people were all aces among aces. Each of them was proud and unyielding, particularly powerful figures like Li Bohua and 13th Wang. They were either the leaders of the greatest money house in the world or warriors most likely to become great grandmasters. How could they lower their heads to the power of a country? There were not many people in Dongyi who were hot-blooded. If there were 10, at least 90% were left in the hearts of the disciples of the Sword Hut. Hearing the master's words, the disciples of the Sword Hut did not disobey. They knew that Sir Fan Jr. was giving them a way out. After a moment of stalemate, Li Bohua was, in the end, more experienced and prudent. After a long silence, he let out a long sigh. 2 streams of hot tears flowed down silently. Leading his disciples, he quietly walked into the city and opened up the path into the city. 13th Wang did not follow and leave. He also did not kneel. He just stood coldly by Fan Xian's side and looked at the menacing Qing riders. It was as if he had no one in his eyes. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian with deep meaning in his eyes. Eunuch Dai unfurled the imperial edict in his hand and read it quietly to the Dongyi officials and merchants kneeling in front of the ceremonial guards. "Hearing that Sir has passed, I am grieved and cannot rest easy. Hearing that Sir is righteous and prioritizes the people, I feel respect in my heart. Fan Xian stood to the side of the road and quietly listened to the most important imperial edict. He found that this imperial edict was not like the ones in the past, which were all standardized. It truly had the tone of the emperor. Furthermore, the grief and respect in his words were not false. As for how the people of Dongyi would view the Qing emperor who had killed Sigujien, that was another matter. This imperial edict was very long. It described the Qing emperor's greetings to the people of Dongyi and the importance of unifying the world for the people. Each word was sincere. In the end, the emperor approved of Yun Jilan's appointment as the master of Dongyi and ordered him to choose a time to enter the capital to accept the title. Yun Jilan, who was kneeling at the very front, heard this edict and was not surprised. Although his position as master of the city had been obtained through negotiation, if he wanted to continue holding it, he had to be personally conferred the title by the Qing emperor. He rose somewhat gloomily and accepted the imperial edict with both hands. He then bowed again. The ceremony continued. It was a complicated and important ceremony. It was a ceremony about conquering and being conquered. The great prince dismounted and walked closer to Fan Xian. He looked at him for a moment and then said, "I didn't do well earlier." Fan Xian knew that this brother of his was referring to him having the disciples of the Sword Hut leave. After a moment of silence he replied, "I am already very tired. I don't know what else to do." But the disciples of the Sword Hut still have to demonstrate their attitude. The great prince looked at him warmly. After a moment of silence, he said with extreme seriousness, "However, you have already done well enough. I think, in the entire world in this matter, there is no one who can do better than you." Fan Xian smiled slightly and didn't continue the conversation. He only said, "The disciples of the Sword Hut's attitude will be shown to the emperor." He lowered his head and said to 13th Wang beside him, "13th Wang, you are responsible for arranging the moving of the army." 13th Wang, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly raised his head. He didn't ask why. He only looked calmly at Fan Xian. His meaning was simple. "Why me?" "Because you are a simple person." Fan Xian gave him a reason that he could not refuse. "I have learned something from you. If you are simple, this world will be simple to you." Under the great prince's slightly confused gaze, Fan Xian patted 13th Wang and said, "I think you also hope that this matter can be simpler." The 13th disciple of the Sword Hut, Wang Shi, stood in front of the group of riders. He couldn't help but think of that bright afternoon many years ago when Sangwen had taken him to choose a girl. It was the same helplessness and headache. Chapter 680. Naturally, it was impossible for the 10,000 soldiers the Qing kingdom had sent to be stationed around Dongyi. Although this was the largest city in the world, it was not difficult for it to provide 10,000 soldiers with logistical tents. Due to some reasons that were difficult to explain, a new military camp, which should have been built in 5 days, had yet to be completed. Thus, a portion of the Qing army was only temporarily camped in temporary camps. In the end, 5,600 people remained on Dongyi's side. The rest of the people were stationed in various vassal states to suppress and intimidate. That night, after attending the banquet, the great prince was not in a hurry to rest. Instead, he gently waved his hand at Fan Xian. The two of them flashed into a quiet study. The great prince was silent for a moment. In the end, he first took out a letter from his clothes. Fan Xian glanced over and saw the style of the letter. He was about to kneel down to receive the emperor's secret edict when he was unexpectedly pulled back by the great prince. "It's just the two of us. There is no need for our knees to suffer." The great prince gently shook his head. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Shortly after, he slowly smiled and did not bow again. Accepting the emperor's secret edict from his hands, he opened the seal and read it carefully. He then sank deep into thought and did not speak for a long time. "I will return to the capital first. You will replace me here for 3 months." In the letter, the emperor's tone was very warm. There was an undisguisable admiration for Fan Xian. Fan Xian's mood was relaxed, so his tone was also relaxed. He said to the great prince, "This arrangement is possible. The problem is, when you return to the capital and I come pick you up, are the two of us going on an errand in Dongyi forever? In order to conquer Dongyi as quietly as possible and let the Qing kingdom's financial and military power suffer as little damage as possible, the great prince and Fan Xian, the two sons of the emperor who had Dongyi blood running through their veins, were, without question, the best choices." Although Sigujie's will during the opening ceremony a month ago had strongly pulled Fan Xian onto the path of the Dongyi people and pointed directly at the emperor's heart, The emperor was a wise man. How could he not understand this? On the contrary, he went with the flow and changed his original thoughts. He actually sent the great prince to lead the Qing army to be stationed. Regardless of whether it was the great prince or Fan Xian, they both had half Dongi blood in them. This was an unparalleled weapon when it came to conquering the hearts of the Dongi people. At least, the conquered people would feel much better every time they thought of the Qing nobility above their heads being half Dongi. Particularly the great prince, he was a true prince. His birth mother's past was known to the world. Having him stationed in Dongi could also represent the mixing of blood between the Qing kingdom and Dongi. If one truly wanted to conquer a piece of land, the mixing of blood was, without question, the most powerful weapon. The emperor saw far into the future. However, it was impossible for the emperor to allow the great prince and Fan Xian to stay in Dongi for a long time. He only had these two grown princes and needed them by his side to help with court and military affairs. His sons were too far away from Jingdo. The Qing emperor was also faintly worried about the two princes who clearly did not have much of the Li family heir. Fan Xian was well aware of this worry, so he was not surprised by the instructions in the secret edict. He only had a headache. The great prince had come and he was about to leave. What would he do in the future? Someone needs to be stationed in Dongi. He looked at the great prince and asked, "What exactly does the emperor plan to do? Are you going to do it or am I going to do it?" "I'm not sure either." A faint worry appeared between the great prince's brows. He was not a normal Qing official or commoner. Although he felt incomparable joy and shock at Fan Xian's ability to convince Sigujien to subdue the Sword Hut and swallow the land and people of Dongi into the Qing kingdom's territory without a drop of blood, he was thinking more about whether or not this process would proceed smoothly. Although the Qing Iron Riders had effectively intimidated the hearts of most of the Dongi people outside Dongi, the behavior of the disciples of the Sword Hut made the great prince wary. He glanced at Fan Xian deeply and said, "Although the emperor did not say it explicitly regarding the Sword Hut, it is clear that he is not happy with this move. At the time I was forced into a corner. Either I take over the Sword Hut or I start from the beginning." Fan Xian laughed coldly. "Did you think I wanted to be a fatty piece of meat caught between hard buns?" Father's intentions were clear. At the very least you have to go back and report. The great prince furrowed his brows slightly. Shortly after he sighed. "I am only here to temporarily replace you. Father will not be at ease with me staying in Dongi for long." Fan Xian sank into silence. He knew the great prince was speaking from the bottom of his heart. The great prince had always had some care and closeness toward Dongi. After all, Lady Ning had been giving him orders for many years. Additionally, he had military power in his hands. The emperor would rather stay in Dongi himself than be at ease leaving Dongi to the great prince. It was not difficult to carve out land and make a king. What kind of land to carve out and who to make a king was the difficult matter. In any case, the emperor has not rushed me. I will stay in Dongi for a while and help you sort out the situation, Fan Xian said. After the situation has stabilized, I will return to the capital. The great prince nodded and then said, "The Overwatch Council still needs you to manage it. Presumably, father will not always have you away from Jingdo. After you return to Jingdo, ask around and see what the future plans are for Dongi." "You are worried that the emperor will send a powerful figure over and incite a civil revolt in Dongi?" Fan Xian gazed at him with a slight smile. "I have made arrangements here. As half a Dongi person you don't have to worry too much." His tone became serious. "Even if you are worried you have to bury it in your stomach and not let others see." The great prince knew that his brother truly cared about him. His heart moved. He nodded. "Is Qin Pingping preparing to leave?" Fan Xian took a sip of cold tea and felt his mouth dry. He raised his gaze and glanced at him. This great prince had a close relationship with Qin Pingping. Presumably, he was well aware of what was happening in Qin Garden. He has already begun to make preparations. A few days ago, he went into the palace to ask for his resignation. The great prince did not know that Director Qin, whom he viewed as an elder, had once had treasonous thoughts toward his father. He did not see this matter as serious. He only thought that Director Qin was getting old and should retire. Thinking of how he would leave Jingdo and not knowing if he would see him again in this life, the great prince felt a bit lost in his heart. Fan Xian was silent. He calculated in his heart for a long time and then ignored this question. In the end he asked, "The troops coming to Dongi this time, are they truly all the Western Expedition Army? Can you completely control them?" "The soldiers are all old. The problem is that there are many strangers in the middle ranks," the great prince said coldly with narrowed eyes. In the next few days he was still badly battered. The complicated handover and name-changing ceremonies happened everywhere in Dongyi. Fortunately, the Ministry of Rites and Honglu Temple sent a large number of capable officials. Only then did Fan Xian not vomit blood because of these things. What truly battered him was a popular uprising in the Liang Kingdom to the northwest of Dongyi. During the mobilization of the people to resist the Qing invaders, a Liang scholar who was deeply respected by the people self-immolated on the street. Black smoke rose and immediately ignited the hatred in the hearts of the Liang people. Only now did Fan Xian truly understand how childish his initial thoughts were. To truly conquer a foreign country, it was impossible to do so without bloodshed. The great prince had already led the army over to suppress it. Before he left, Fan Xian seriously exhorted that if it was possible for the Qing army to not act, then they must not act. Once the Qing army's hands were stained with the blood of the Dongyi people, it would be difficult to wash it clean. This kind of hatred could never be resolved. The great prince followed the plan and sent a stern-worded letter to the manor of the master of the city in Dongyi, rebuking the master of the city, Yun Zhilan. He then urged the manor to be the vanguard and the local martial power as the vanguard to suppress the unrest in the Liang kingdom. The Qing army was the rear and maintained a certain distance. After the great prince and Yun Zhilan both left Dongyi, all affairs were handed to Fan Xian to handle. He hid by the seaside and thought of the never-ending sparks of fire in Dongyi. He felt a wave of irritation. It should be better to have the manor of the city suppress it. It was probably like the puppet army in his previous life. Fan Xian sat on a large rock by the seaside and smiled bitterly. He knew that no matter what he did, no matter how Sigu Jian's last words and the disciples of the Sword Hut cooperated with him, he still could not change the fact that in the hearts of the people of Dongyi, he was an evil invader. How exactly do you want to deal with the matter of the Liang kingdom? 13th Wang, who had become more and more silent these few months, was sitting by his side. Suddenly he asked, "Do you want the army to massacre the people?" The manor of the master of the city does not have an army. It only has the power and position that it has developed over the years. Fan Xian knew why 13th Wang was asking this. After all, he was a Dongyi person. Yet, he had to suppress the unrest in the Liang kingdom that he saw as righteous. Presumably, his feelings were complicated. He paused for a moment and then quietly said, "I have orders to try to keep as few people as possible dead. In the end, people will still die. Furthermore, once the weapons move, how will you control them?" 13th Wang's gaze was confused. He only stared at the rise and fall of the waves on the ocean. Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at him. His expression gradually became serious. "Do you know the scholar who burned himself to death?" "In the past, Sir Gu often came to the sword hut to speak with the teacher," 13th Wang replied. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the world. Although I have never seen this Sir Gu, presumably he is also a remarkable figure. The chaos in the Liang kingdom started because of him, but I am unable to deal with him. As for his family, don't worry. I will protect them. Sir Gu's ancestral hall will be built as soon as possible after the matter is over." 13th Wang looked at him in a daze. After a long time he said, "You don't truly respect him. You just need to put on this attitude to appease the people of the Liang kingdom." "That's what all invaders do," Yi Zichen said. Fan Xian's expression was slightly dim. "However, I am surprised that you can think of this. 13th, you are becoming more and more remarkable. I've seen too many things. No one can be simple." 13th Wang stared into his eyes and said, "You once promised the teacher that you wouldn't let the people of Dongyi bleed. I don't like to see blood. Otherwise, why would I be tied to this carriage by the sword hut?" Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. His smile gradually became icy. "But necessary blood must be shed. Otherwise, if it continues to be chaotic, it will be like a whirlpool that will swallow all of Dongyi. At that time, even more people will die." He turned his head and looked calmly at 13th Wang. "I know what you are angry about. I also know what you are sad about. Look at my eyes and think of what I have sacrificed. Don't forget, if you only consider it from the perspective of my own interests, if the Qing army attacked, I would be free and unfettered. At most, I would cry for the innocent people of Dongyi. Why would I suffer like this? If the two sides start to fight, Dongyi will certainly lose. The number of deaths will be in the hundreds of thousands," Fan Xian said with his eyes closed. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "My philosophy of life is very simple. Since this matter cannot be stopped, then the fewer people who die, the better. There is no difference between 10 lives and 10,000 lives," 13th Wang said. "Wrong," Fan Xian said resolutely. I don't care if a life has a price. I only know that a person's life is unique. 100,000 unique lives are more important than 10, 100, or 1,000. If the heavens gave me a multiple-choice question between 100,000 lives and 99,999 lives, I would certainly choose the former because there is one more in the former. The people of Dongyi should learn to be grateful to me. Fan Xian looked into 13th Wang's eyes and calmly said, I have allowed many people who should have died to live. 13th Wang was silent for a long time. He then said, but these people did not need to die. The emperor's cause requires them to die, so they must die. Fan Xian stood up from the large rock. Even your teacher was unable to stop him. You should understand the pressure I am under. Fan Xian patted the sand from behind his butt and narrowed his eyes at the endless ocean. Sometimes I find that I am almost Gao de Quan. What is Gao de Quan? An inhuman description, Fan Xian shrugged. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders. But, thinking about it carefully, I am not Gao Quan. I am just willing to do this. I will not die for some ideal or some spiritual need, such as burning myself like Mr. Gu. I am a person who knows how to run and is good at running. He then turned around and looked at 13th Wang. Calmly he said, that day Sigu Jian and I talked quietly in the room. You should have heard the contents of our conversation. Do you have any understanding of the tyrannical Jinqi? Chapter 681. 13th Wang heard these words and thought for a moment. He didn't reply. Instead he stood up in front of Fan Xian and slowly pulled out the sword at his waist. 13th Wang was not the green banner fortune teller who walked the world and experienced people's hearts. Rather, he was a swordsman who followed Fan Xian and refused to live alone. Fan Xian's expression became serious. His right hand climbed to his back and pulled out the Wei Emperor's sword. The light of the sword was like autumn water. It reflected the seawater not far away and rippled even more. Without any warning, the silent sword stabbed a foot in front of Fan Xian's face. This was the first time Fan Xian had truly seen 13th Wang use a sword. Only now did he understand why Sigu Jian had entrusted all of his legacy to this young man. Without question, 13th Wang's understanding of sword intent had reached a very high realm. With a thought, the tip of the sword arrived. It seemed to have already surpassed the restrictions of the environment. This was the terrifying realm brought about by the tenacity of one's heart. Once 13th Wang moved his sword, there were no stray thoughts in his heart. There was only this sword. The Emperor's sword in Fan Xian's hand was still pointed 45 degrees into the sky. He had no time to react. His face was pale. The tyrannical Jinqi at the back of his waist exploded. Without any delay he forced himself up. Like a seagull, he flapped his wings and glided toward the back of the beach. One slide was 150 feet. This was not a strange movement that a human should have. 13th Wang's sword was an assassin. The cold light at the tip of the sword slowly retracted. A sword mark appeared without reason on the beach in front of him. It was as if someone had walked by and a sword had passed by. It was a deep mark. The two of them were 150 feet apart. Fan Xian still held the Emperor's sword tightly in his hand. Suddenly, he had a feeling that 13th Wang's seemingly light and direct strike had a hint of the startling strike the shadow had made that day in the manner of the master of Dongyi. The shadow had gathered decades of cultivation and hatred. He stared in a daze at the silent 13th Wang. A moment later he said, "What a tyrannical strike." As the words left his mouth, he realized his voice was a bit hoarse. Presumably, in order to avoid this simple strike, the Jinqi in his body had increased too much in a short amount of time and injured his lungs. Fan Xian took a deep breath. The pale complexion on his face gradually returned to normal. He glanced deeply at 13th Wang and said, pressing forward with indomitable will, "This is indeed your method. Usually you were not this fast or powerful. I've cultivated the tyrannical true qi, but I couldn't even pass the first stage. However, I've experienced the taste of this technique." 13th Wang's attack was ineffective. He slowly closed his eyes and said, "I've already thought it through. I shouldn't bite off more than I can chew. I have the sword in my hand. Why should I learn the Qing Emperor's secret?" The nameless art formula was too domineering, especially at the first checkpoint. His mind and body were completely separated, completely conflicting and uncontrollable. It was too similar to qi deviation. Back then, Fan Xian had easily passed this trial because the last years of his previous life had all been spent in bed. He had long gotten used to being in a vegetative state where his entire body could not move and only his brain could move. Thus, Fan Xian was not surprised that 13th Wang had not stepped onto the path of the tyrannical martial formula. He was only surprised at 13th Wang's ability to comprehend. In such a short amount of time, he had sensed the dangers of the tyrannical martial formula. Furthermore, he had such high intelligence to immediately stop his search in this area. If I couldn't dodge that attack just now, would you have killed me? Fan Xian asked with slight mockery as the corners of his mouth twitched. 13th Wang was silent for a moment and then shook his head. He was a bit tired. He sat down directly on the slightly wet beach. That attack had appeared simple. It was just a basic bending of the elbow. To explode out with such speed and carry such a decisive stance, it had used up too much of his energy. In a short amount of time, it was impossible for 13th Wang to stab out a second time. It was just like how the shadow could only stab out that attack against Sigu Jian in the manner. Fan Xian clearly understood this point. Slowly raising his feet, he walked toward 13th Wang's side. With a strange emotion he said, "Many people say that one shouldn't bite off more than one can chew. Even you have such a clear judgment. Usually I always thought that more skills did not weigh me down. Was I wrong?" A faint trace of doubt flashed through his eyes. "There are 4 great grandmasters in the world. In addition to my blind uncle, of the 5 ultimate skills, I have grasped 4. Even the Yi family's flowing cloud Sansho has been mostly grasped by me." He sat in front of 13th Wang and furrowed his brows. "In the world, no, in all of history, I am the only one who has learned so many ultimate skills. Today I was forced back by one attack from you. What is the use of learning so much? To be able to learn so much already shows that you are the most terrifying person in the world." 13th Wang's temperament was simple, but he was not like De Bao. He acutely sensed the sense of defeat gradually rising in Fan Xian's heart. Looking into his eyes he said, "Any martial technique requires us to use our most focused thoughts and a lifetime to cultivate, practice and perfect. Furthermore, it is an ultimate skill left behind by a great grandmaster. For you to be able to cultivate 4 of them to the extreme in a short period of 20 years is already shocking enough." Fan Xian had cultivated the ultimate skills of the 4 great grandmasters. In front of 13th Wang's attack, he had to temporarily retreat. Involuntarily he thought of Sigu Jian's realm and the Emperor's realm. A sadness that was difficult to suppress grew in his heart. 13th Wang looked into his eyes and quietly said, "Your ability to comprehend is very good, particularly with your strong foundations. Additionally, with such good luck, you should be the most powerful person in the world. My ability to comprehend is only average, particularly in front of you and Haitang Duo. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "All I can rely on is hard work. However, there is a limit to one's strength. Even if I were to work twice as hard as I am now, I would still not be able to break through that piece of paper." Fan Xian was able to easily dodge 13th Wang's attack that seemed to have come from the heavens. Additionally, he had long hidden the ultimate skills in his sleeves and body, particularly his sinister battle personality, and the ingenuity the Overwatch Council had given him. He was confident that no matter which 9th level ace he faced in the world, he would be able to defeat them. Even if it was 13th Wang, Haitang, Lang Tiao or Yun Jilan, once they faced him, the one to die in the end would be them. After Yi Luyun left this world, regardless of whether it was power or personal cultivation, Fan Xian would, without question, be the second in the world. 13th Wang had also sensed this from Fan Xian's seemingly easy and casual slide earlier. A faint sense of awe rose in his heart. He looked at Fan Xian and still could not understand how a young man in his 20s could raise his cultivation to such a realm. The realms of the 3 young people in the world were similar. However, Fan Xian was more ruthless and had more tricks than the other 2. "How did you retreat that time?" 13th Wang asked him with narrowed eyes. Fan Xian was silent for a long time and didn't reply. He only turned his head back and stared at the gradually rising and falling white waves on the ocean. He had already stayed in Dongyi for a long time. The booklet Master Ku he had left behind was deeply imprinted in his mind. Each time he meditated by the seaside, those words would pour into his mind. Although he still didn't understand most of the meaning, miraculously as long as he thought about it, it seemed that there were minute factors inside and outside of his body that began to resonate with each other. His body became lighter and his movements became faster. The recovery rate of the Jinqi in his body also increased. It was as if there truly was a kind of invisible and untouchable Yuanqi in the world that was willing to follow his thoughts to replenish what he had lost. However, this kind of replenishment made his heart palpitate. Was this the magic of the West? Humans would always have a fear of things they did not know of. What made Fan Xian even more indifferent was that the changes the little booklet brought him were not enough to solve too many problems. The speed of replenishment was too slow, and the increase in realm was too small. It seemed that the second in the world could only ever be the second in the world. For a moment, Fan Xian even wondered if he had made a huge mistake. Regardless of whether it was Master Ku He, Sigujien Yi Luyun, or the Emperor, these people at the top of the world were far above him in terms of willpower and diligence and cultivation. However, these great grandmasters only cultivated their own unique skills and never had their hearts set on anything else. He had learned too many things and knew too many things. It was too messy. Fan Xian had a feeling that it would probably be easier for 13th Wang and Duo to break through that piece of paper than him. This was probably the intention Sigujien had spoken of. His intention was still not as firm as those two people. Because he was too afraid, he did not care about the price to find a way to make himself stronger. Perhaps this kind of purposefulness was inferior, but he was truly afraid. He was afraid of death. He was afraid of the people he cared about dying. I am returning to the capital the day after tomorrow. A slight smile suddenly rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. As long as Dongyi does not fall into chaos, at least the world is still peaceful. Why should I worry about so many things? Dongyi belonged to the Qing kingdom. Although there were waves of unrest, with the suppression of the Qing kingdom's powerful military power and the cooperation of the upper echelons of Dongyi, it was impossible to raise any major waves. The emperor's trust in Fan Xian remained. Qin Pingping was about to leave the capital to retire. Thinking of this, Fan Xian stood against the sea breeze and felt very comfortable. Regardless of whether or not Uncle Wu Zhu would return, it seemed that as long as they followed this trend, he and the emperor would always be able to find a second path. Bloodshed was not necessarily necessary. Bloodshed was necessary. When the autumn wind began to pass through the small hills behind Dongyi, Fan Xian had finally taken care of most of the affairs in Dongyi. By the time the great prince and Yun Jilan returned, the first major turmoil after Dongyi's surrender was finally extinguished within the borders of the Liang kingdom with the cooperation of both sides. The flames that had been lit by the self-immolation of the great scholar, Sir Gu, were quickly extinguished by the blood and were unable to spread for long. Over 400 people died in the Liang kingdom. These hot-blooded Dongyi people unfortunately lay in pools of blood. Fan Xian read through the general memorials and gave some instructions to the great prince. He then boarded the carriages leaving Dongyi. He was once again returning to Jingdo to debrief. Conquering a piece of land brought about daily nervousness, busyness, and killing for these expeditionary officials. After the great prince parted with Fan Xian, he led the garrison troops and coldly watched every movement in Dongyi. At this time he and Fan Xian both felt that the general situation was set. If they continued to slowly struggle like this, regardless of whether it was the Qing court or the general situation of the world, they would all be within a controllable range. Thus the two brothers were in good moods. In the crisp autumn air, their hearts were incomparably refreshed and had thrown away all their worries. Fan Xian could even temporarily not think about the problem of Ten Family Village and the problems of the past. As for the popular man in court, He Zongwei, in his eyes, he was just a clown and could not affect anything at all. Today was a good day. These few days were rare good days in Fan Xian's life. The Black Overwatch Council carriages left Dongyi and slowly made their way back to the capital. Fan Xian was not in a hurry to return to the capital. Looking at the golden, slightly yellow and deep yellow leaves around him, as well as the autumn mountains that had been painted into an oil painting, was also a rare enjoyment. Of course, blood continued to flow non-stop along the way. As a powerful official of the Qing kingdom, the master of the sword hut, the representative of the invaders, and the Qing emperor's favorite illegitimate child, Fan Xian became the emperor's favorite. On his way back to the capital, Fan Xian became the first target of the volunteer armies of the vassal states around Dongyi and the rebellious people. Perhaps it was not appropriate to call them rebellious people. They were righteous people. Most of the righteous people in Dongyi refused to accept surrender and bravely entered the mountains to fight the Qing invaders. Most of the people in Dongyi who refused to accept surrender and bravely entered the mountains to fight the Qing invaders were people of the Jianghu. These people, who had martial strength, were clearly more direct when it came to protecting their own moral principles. No one knew how these people found out when Fan Xian left Dongyi and grasped the route of the Overwatch Council carriages back to the capital. Along the way they began to launch assassinations and even suicidal attacks on the powerful Qing officials in the black carriages. After arriving in Yanjing for about 20 days, the black carriages had been attacked 7 times. The troops from Yanjing and the Black Knights stationed at the border had not come to receive them. The great prince had only given Fan Xian a 1,000-man army. Thus, dealing with these 7 major attacks was rather difficult. Fan Xian no longer had any interest in admiring the scenery. Instead, he sank deep into thought. His personal safety was not a problem. The attacking volunteer armies often had no choice but to retreat after leaving behind countless corpses. However, his subordinates, especially the Great Prince's Western Expedition Army, had also paid a great price for this. Because they had sunk into a non-stop attack, the top-secret council reports from Jingdo had not arrived for 3 days. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked west with narrowed eyes. He silently prayed for Jingdo and the people he cared about to be safe. While Fan Xian was traversing through the mountains within the Qing kingdom's borders, there was also a long group of carriages moving through the lonely night. This group of carriages was also pure black. In the very wide carriage in the middle, there was an old man with a woolen blanket covering his knees. His gaze was slightly turbid. Looking at the night road, he felt that this road seemed to never end. The former director of the Overwatch Council, the person who had secretly controlled the Qing kingdom's dark powers for decades, the Qing emperor's most loyal official, the most hated enemy of the Qing civil officials, the old thief that northern Qi and Dongyi people feared the most, and a major figure who had once influenced the entire situation under heaven, Sir Qin Pingping had finally embarked on his journey to retire. This time he was not leaving Jingdo to return home to visit his family. He was returning home to settle down. First-class merit, countless rewards, and returning home to retire was a rare honor the emperor had given this old dog. All of the Qing civil officials thought so. Qin Pingping's home was to the east of the Qing kingdom. If one looked at it from a map, it was below Dongyi. However, it was a great distance from Danzhou and Jiaozhou. On the contrary, it was closer to Jiangnan. It was an impoverished area that was not very developed. The solitary group of carriages returning home was still far from home. Today the group only passed through Dazhou. This was a province that Qin Pingping had to pass through on his way home. The group of carriages did not notify the officials along the way to avoid startling all of them into coming out in fear and trepidation to kowtow to the old director. However, Dazhou was brightly lit today. The bailiffs of the government were busily searching for something under the strict scolding of the Ministry of Justice's officials. Qin Pingping narrowed his eyes. He didn't remember any important figure in Dazhou. He lifted the curtain and summoned an unfamiliar official beside him. In a quiet voice he asked a few questions. The official's face was unfamiliar, but there was a craftiness in his eyes that came from understanding the affairs of the world. He smiled warmly and replied, "When the commissioner returned to the capital, we had arrived a long time ago." Qin Pingping hummed tiredly, but a complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. He thought of the conversation he had with the emperor in the royal palace before he left Jingdo. He had already seen the deepest meaning in the emperor's heart. Chapter 682. Many years later, when the Overwatch Council began to comb through the major event in the early autumn of the 10th year of the Qing Kingdom, there were still many questions that could not be explained clearly. When Director Fan Xian returned to the capital from Dongyi, he was ambushed by the Dongyi Volunteer Army. Was this news purposely released by someone in court, or was it just a coincidence? After all, it seemed that only a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council could know the little duke's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Dazhou, the place where Ol Amos was on his way home to retire, happened to be brightly lit and filled with murderous intent. Was this a coincidence or was it God's will? Perhaps it was the latter, but at that time the sky had long changed color. The intelligence officials of the Second Bureau of the Overwatch Council did not pursue the matter closely. At least, the officials of the Ministry of Justice handling official business in Dazhou did not know that at the time, there was a long line of black Overwatch Council carriages outside the city. No one knew that Director Qin, whom all the court officials regarded as a ghost and feared, was in the carriages. They had only received secret orders from their superiors and spent more than a year chasing after a criminal. As for the criminal's name, no one knew. All the clues they had were the criminal's martial skills and habits, as well as the appearance he had used. As for what the criminal had become in these 3 years, no one knew. Perhaps this was the will of the heavens for Qin Pingping to encounter the encirclement in Dazhou. It was also because Qin Pingping had comprehended the will of the heavens that he had stopped his journey home in Dazhou and returned to Jingdo, where he should have stayed for the rest of his life. Everything about Florida started more than a month ago, and it wasn't just about Florida. At that time, Fan Xian was still by the seaside, thinking hard about the will Sigu Jian had imparted to him and the little book Master Ku he had left behind. He experienced the nature of the tyrannical Jinchi in his body and guessed whether or not the emperor's cultivation of the tyrannical martial method would create an unbearable burden on his body. He was watching the waves rise and fall, thinking that everything in the world was the same as yesterday, that the spring flowers had already bloomed, the autumn moon was hanging high in the sky, that he was the second most powerful man in the world, feeling proud of himself, thinking that nothing was difficult, that everything could be solved. However, the world had already undergone subtle changes at that time. That day was the beginning of July. The entire land was enveloped by the hottest sun of the year. Jingdo in the Qin kingdom was no exception. The third prince, Li Qingze, was reading a book with both hands. Beads of sweat dripped from his delicate face. Back then he had been the youngest brothel owner in the world. After experiencing the rebellion in the palace and countless bloodshed, he had finally transformed his unconcealable ruthlessness into a steady and firm will that did not match his age. The third prince, Li Qingze, had already become a young man who treated people with courtesy, filial piety, and a young man who no one could find too many faults with. There were two people who had caused him to change so much in a short 5 or 6 years. One was his father and the other was his teacher, his elder brother, Fan Xian. When facing the emperor, the third prince was careful and could not make any mistakes. It was a blood-like truth. The deaths of the crown prince's elder brother and second brother made Li Qingze understand very well what a terrifying existence his father was. Although these two brothers had once tried to kill him in the later years and their deaths were a good thing for Li Qingze, when facing his father, he still couldn't stop a chill from spreading out from his heart. Because he was afraid, he was respectful and cautious, so he could not make any mistakes. During these 3 years, Li Qingze had even seen less of Fan Xian. He only shut himself up in the royal palace. Occasionally he could find out through his mother what the teacher had done. Li Qingze was also afraid of Fan Xian, his elder brother who could not be announced to the public. In the most important days of his adolescence, he had always followed Fan Xian and watched as Fan Xian, as an official, started a war between Jiangnan and the nobles in Jingdo and obtained the final victory. The pointer in Fan Xian's hand and cold gaze made him even more afraid to make any mistakes. Fan Xian's true influence on the third prince was that he let the third prince know what he was going to do in the future and what he was going to become. Only then did he truly change his personality. The third prince, Li Qingze, was destined to become the emperor of the Qin kingdom. The entire world was his, so he had to treat the world better. He was no longer like in the past, spending so much sinister thoughts to steal for the sake of some silver and realistic and short-term benefits. The world is mine and it will be mine. Why should I torment it? This was the creed Fan Xian taught the third prince, and the third prince deeply believed it. The serving girl, Xing was gradually getting older. The young and inexperienced girl had gradually matured and developed a moving beauty. Xing was at the side fanning the prince. She watched with furrowed brows as the prince continued to read while sweating. She couldn't help but feel a bit of pity in her heart. Yigui Pin was chatting idly in Lady Ning's palace. There were not many idle people in Shufang Palace. Xing looked at the prince's handsome young appearance. Her gaze gradually grew distant. Li Qingze clearly felt this gaze. The corners of his lips twitched into a smile. He didn't make any reaction. He only gently placed his hand behind his back and pinched the tip of Xing's finger. His smile was very similar to Fan Xian's. Do you want to rest first? Xing's face reddened slightly. It's such a hot day and the emperor won't be coming. Li Qingze shook his head seriously and said in a quiet voice, these are all on the list of books Sir made. Most of them are classics he dragged back from northern Qi. I have to finish reading them this year and write notes for him to review. He smiled bitterly and said, if I don't pass, mother will beat me again. Xing bit her lip and said, the duke is in Dongyi right now. He doesn't have time to worry about so much. After the Jingdo rebellion was quelled, although the emperor did not remove Fan Xian's identity as a teacher, Fan Xian rarely went alone to see the third prince. The third prince also did not often cause trouble and leave the palace. The two brothers both knew that the third prince was the true heir to the Qin kingdom. The emperor would not want this heir to grow up under Fan Xian's education. He would rather be taught by himself. In order to avoid this taboo, the two of them could only reduce their meeting. Although Fan Xian rarely came to Shufang Palace, he still did not stop training the third prince in his studies. When he was in Jiangnan, Fan Xian had already told the third prince many stories. During these 3 years he still made many lists of books and requested that the third prince read them all. Other than being busy with official business, Fan Xian would also find time to look through the third prince's reading notes. For him this was of the utmost importance. If the future of the Qin kingdom was placed on Li Qingze's shoulders, he hoped that Li Qingze could become a benevolent ruler. Even if he did not have any great ambitions, he would at least be able to look after his family business well. Every year during the new year, Fan Xian's family would enter the palace. That was the time he looked through the third prince's homework. Often, the whistling of the pointer could be heard in Shufang Palace, as well as the third prince's painful cries. Xing Er's expression was not normal. It was clear that she had become Li Qingze's first woman after he came of age. Of course, Li Qingze was also her first woman. Hearing Sir Fan Jr.'s name, Xing Er's eyes became unbearable. She said unhappily, "Sir Fan Jr. is also like this. He always strikes and doesn't pay attention to propriety at all." When Fan Xian had first entered the palace, it had been her who had taken him everywhere to visit. After these years of interaction, Xing Er did not feel that the incomparably powerful Sir Fan Jr. outside the palace was anything to be afraid of. She only felt that he was still the delicate and pretty young man from back then, so her words were not very respectful. Li Qingze was very afraid of Fan Xian. With a pained expression he said, because of this, he dared to talk back to father. Mother is also standing on his side. What can I do? Although he said this, he did not bear any grudge. On the contrary, he was faintly lost in thought. He sighed and said, "It's been a long time since I've left the palace. I wonder how the matter in Dongyi is going." Speaking of this, even Xing Er's face couldn't help but light up a little. She smiled and said, "With Sir Fan Jr. taking action, what can there be that can't be done? Word has been going around in the palace that the Dongyi matter has been settled. The great prince will immediately lead troops over." The third prince naturally knew of the most important matter in the court. Thinking of how the teacher had performed such a great service for the court, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He nodded and said, "It would be great if I could go as well." A sense of longing suddenly appeared on the youth's face. "The happiest days of my life were actually 2 periods outside the palace. One was when I was managing Baoyue brothel with Xija. The other was when I was taken to Jiangnan by Sir. I don't know when I will be able to leave the palace again." In the process of anyone's growth, they would always unconsciously seek out a powerful person of the same sex as their goal and target to imitate. Even the princes born in the royal palace were no exception. However, they matured much earlier than the youth of the common people. When Li Qingze was in the beginning stages of puberty, there were 2 large mountains in front of him that he needed to look up to. One was his father and the other was Fan Xian. However, the Qing emperor's power carried a coldness that kept people away and his family away. It was Fan Xian's power that truly had a bit of smoke and fire. It carried a stubborn, simple and direct closeness. Thus the third prince missed Fan Xian very much. A voice came from outside Shufang Palace. Before it could be sent, a head eunuch had already bent over and entered the inner palace. Xing Er furrowed her brows and glanced at the head eunuch. She gently bowed behind the third prince, not daring to be lacking in etiquette. The person who came was Eunuch Yao, the head eunuch in the royal palace and a close official deeply trusted by the emperor. Li Qingze narrowed his eyes and glanced at him. He felt it was strange. He didn't know what matter required him to personally come here. "Eunuch Yao, what is it?" Eunuch Yao was a person who knew his limits. Although he was the emperor's trusted aide, he knew that the third prince he was facing was one of the only 2 men in the palace and the future emperor. Thus, he properly bowed before evenly saying, "There is an old case being investigated in the internal court. There are some matters that are related to your highness, so I had no choice but to come and disturb your highness." Li Qingze's pupils constricted slightly. Without question he was a clever person. From these words he had gleaned a lot of information. An old case. Related to him? He had lived in the depths of the palace for many years. What kind of case could truly touch him? Furthermore, what kind of case would disturb him? Baoyue brothel? Impossible. Back then, Fan Xian had used this matter to cripple the second prince. It had been with the emperor's approval. Now he could not bring it up again. Furthermore, given his present identity, no one would have the courage to bring it up. The light in Li Qingze's eyes dimmed slightly. He knew what the internal court was investigating. 3 years ago there was a rebellion in Jingdo. The palace was in chaos. The third prince, Yi Guipin and Lady Ning were all placed under house arrest in Hongguang Palace. At such a critical moment, someone in the palace wanted to assassinate Li Qingze. If he did not have the poison dagger Fan Xian had personally made, he would probably have died a long time ago. Afterward, there were some doubts about this matter both inside and outside the palace. At the time, the crown prince had already controlled the situation in the palace. Why would he do such an unreasonable thing? People also thought it was the second prince who did it. In the investigation afterward, they did not find any connection. Li Qingze's own memory of the matter was particularly deep. He also wanted to find out who wanted to kill him. However, the Overwatch Council investigated for a long time and could not find any clues. Fan Xian had once told him in private to stop investigating this matter. Thus, the third prince suppressed the anger in his heart and no longer paid attention to it. He knew that the teacher must have caught wind of something, which was why he did not continue investigating for him. Yet, the internal court was investigating this matter now? Concern for his own safety, anger toward the murderer who wanted to kill him, and trust in Fan Xian struggled for a moment in the third prince's mind. He made up his mind and shook his head. I was quite frightened that day. I don't remember anything. Would I trouble your highness to come with me to draw a portrait? After the two eunuchs were killed by Li Qingze, their bodies were quickly burned in the chaos. Too many eunuchs had died in the palace rebellion that day. Even now, no one knew who the third prince's assassin was. Eunuch Yao glanced at the third prince and spoke respectfully. Li Qingze's brows furrowed. He sensed something strange. I still need to read. Since I am fine, don't worry about such a small matter. How can that be? Your highness is a member of the royal family. How dare someone have thoughts of disloyalty toward your highness? The emperor is furious and has ordered a thorough investigation. Li Qingze narrowed his eyes and looked at Eunuch Yao. He wondered what his father wanted to do now. If he was truly furious, then what had he been doing these 3 years? At the beginning of July, the third prince, Li Qingze, began to think back to the palace rebellion and the appearance of the two eunuchs who wanted to kill him. That night, the young mistress of the Jingdo government was lost in thought as she watched the two approaching stars in the sky. She knew that her father's days had been much better. With the little duke's help, no one in court dared to target the Jingdo government again. Even the popular man of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, Sir He Zhongwei, had not been as ruthless as before. He was only quiet. Thinking of Sir Fan Jr., she couldn't help but think of the condition he had promised her during the Jingdo rebellion. A light smile gradually rose to the corners of her lips. Qin Garden was bustling. Qin Pingping was making preparations to return to his hometown. None of the beautiful concubines in Qin Garden were willing to leave as he expected. Instead, they cried and shouted that they wanted to follow him back to his hometown and send him off. While the old cripple was puzzled and helpless, he couldn't help but think that perhaps when they looked at Fan Xian, they were not looking at cucumbers. Rather, they already had cucumbers. In the Fan Manor in the south of Jingdo, Lin Wan'er and Cici were holding a pair of children and feeding them. A few nannies and serving girls were chatting to the side. The wife of the Ting family was in front of the steps reporting in detail on this year's harvest in the Fan Manor. In one of the 3 study rooms in the back garden, the Hangzhou Conference's accounting masters were waiting to report to their mistress on the amount of silver they had spent in the Jiangnan and Jiangbei areas to help the people. Lin Wan'er handed the bowl of porridge to a nanny and kissed Xiaohua and Fan Liang on each cheek. She then walked to the door and stretched. Her actions were indeed not like that of a young mistress. However, Fan Xian spoiled her, so she was used to spoiling her freedom. She looked at the multitude of stars in the sky and thought of Fan Xian far away on the shores of the East Sea. Involuntarily, she tilted her head slightly, thinking that everything was on the right track. If she was going to leave Jingdo to live a carefree life, where should she choose? Dongzhou or Dongyi? She suddenly remembered that she had never been to Dongyi and couldn't help but want to go. As she thought this, Fan Ruoruo, dressed as a doctor, pushed open the courtyard door with a medical box on her back and walked in. Behind her were a few servants who were anxious to take over the heavy items. Fan Ruoruo had returned from the countryside. Seeing her sister-in-law standing in the doorway, she couldn't help smiling and making fun of her. In the distant Northern Qi royal palace, the Northern Qi emperor sat on the jade platform in the main hall. She looked at the white sand in the pool beside the platform and the pair of fish lying on the sand. Her faint gaze was still lost in thought. By her hand were a few memorials. They talked about the circumstances of Sigu Jian's death and the inside story of the agreement between Dongyi and the Qin kingdom. Logically speaking, the secret of this agreement was not something the Northern Qi brocade guard could find out. It was clear that the man had purposely leaked the information to her. The Northern Qi emperor narrowed his eyes. For the first time in his life, a perplexed expression appeared. He didn't know what his country or his future would be like. The current situation seemed to be clear. There was no opportunity for the conflict between Fan Xian and the Qing emperor to explode. What should she do? If this had been in the past, Perhaps he would have long made up his mind to have Fan Xian and the Qing Emperor fall out at all costs, even if he had to pay half of the national treasury's income or pay an endless price. Now his thoughts had changed. He knew the power of the words Fan Xian had once said. On that day at the beginning of July, the people of the land all experienced some ordinary or unusual things. A turning point in history, an event that caused the details of history to change, did not happen in Jingdou or Shangjing. Instead, it happened in a remote province in the Qing kingdom. This should have been a routine public security check. The bailiffs walked slowly under the hot sun, occasionally hiding in the shadows of the shops along the street to rest. Gauda, who had hidden his identity for 3 years in disguise, was busy at a noodle stall on the corner of the street. There was a healthy flush on his face. It was no longer as determined as it was in the past. Instead, it was filled with ease and satisfaction. The hand that used to tightly hold a long knife now easily held a long chopstick. With great skill and dexterity, he picked up noodles from the pot and placed them into a bowl. He sprinkled some qinggu on it and the fragrance rose. After escaping from Dong Mountain, Gauda had wandered through the various provinces of the Qing kingdom. The Qing kingdom's strict household registration system and customs clearance document system had made him suffer greatly. Although no one had discovered his identity, it was still difficult for him to settle down to a stable life. He was a tiger guard of the royal family. He had not experienced much. He had no knowledge of the Jianghu at the bottom of the common people. Once this tiger guard wandered into the shallows, it became very difficult for him. Later, by a lucky coincidence, he landed in Dazhou. He finally had a completely new identity. He opened a noodle stall on this street. Every day he basked in the sun and cooked noodles. He even brought back a wife and a son. Perhaps this was true happiness. A wife and a child had a heated bed. Every day, Gauda packed up his stall and came home to hug his wife, who made him feel hot all over. He even felt that even if he didn't use his knife, it wouldn't be a pity. Of course, he was still cautious. Although he had learned over the years that the court had probably decided that all of the tiger guards were dead, he still didn't let the court know of his existence, particularly the internal court. As a tiger guard of the internal court, he knew that secretly escaping was a great crime of deceiving the monarch. Once caught, it would result in the execution of his entire family. He continued to pay attention to Fan Xian's movements. Fortunately, Fan Xian was the most famous person in the Qing kingdom. The discussions in the marketplace were always about Fan Xian. Thus, he knew that the commissioner had been living well these 3 years. Furthermore, he had made many contributions to the Qing kingdom. It was even possible that he could bring Dongyi into the map. Gauda was very happy. After drinking a few times, he felt that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed very powerful. However, he still did not think of going to find Fan Xian and think of a way to get rid of the crime on him. He felt that he was living well now. There was no need to change anything. Chapter 683. The mountains were high, the emperor was far away, and the people in the countryside were cruel. In the present Qing kingdom, all of the officials were under the powerful supervision of the Overwatch Council. However, the Overwatch Council was, after all, a somewhat deformed organization. It was impossible for it to control all the joints of a feudal dynasty from top to bottom. The lower it went, the more remote it was, the more despicable the faces of the officials, the privileged class of officials, became. Dazhou was a remote province. Although the bailiffs and officials here could not be said to be like wolves and tigers, it was clear that they were not good people who loved the people. Particularly on such a hot summer day when the sun made the bailiffs sweat, it had also sunk away much of their rationality. In addition to the 1.5 kilograms of beef and 20 grams of white wine, the alcohol roasted the bailiffs' hearts. They left the small wine beach and came to the noodle stall. With a smile, they stared at the beautiful female boss and began to drool. Teasing a woman in public was not something normal bailiffs and officials would do. If this had happened in the past, these bailiffs would probably have just looked and let it go. For some reason they could not move their feet. The words in their mouths began to become dirty. A few of them, whose faces were red from drinking too much, had the intention of asking the woman in the noodle stall to keep them company. It was all because the yellow wine was too easy to drink, the white wine was too strong, and the woman in the noodle stall was too delicate and pretty. Gauda married a wife in Dazhou. He had never told her what happened in the past. He just lived his life peacefully. Sometimes, he felt that the heavens were indeed looking out for him to have given him such a beautiful wife at the beginning of the second half of his life. She was a widow, mute, and had a son. Even so, Gauda still felt that he was very lucky. She was a famous beauty in Dajo. In Gao Da's eyes, she was not much worse than Sea Lily who had been sent to northern Qi. Furthermore, she was very gentle, virtuous and good, so good that he didn't know what words to use to describe her. In order to hide his true identity, Gao Da should not have married such a dazzling and beautiful woman. However, he liked her and felt pity for her. Incidentally, he also felt pity for the 1-year-old boy. The mute lady also liked the honesty of this stranger, the muscles on his body that were full of strength, and the feeling of reliability and safety. Although she was beautiful, she was a mute widow after all, so she did not expect any good ending in life. She didn't have any relatives in Dajo City. Those men who were always drooling over her probably only coveted her body and wanted to tie her back to be a concubine. It was even just that, her mute wife wasn't willing. She just wanted a simple and warm home. Very naturally, these two people came together. They invited a few neighbors to a meal, and Song Changgong, who came from a foreign land, stayed with the poor mute widow in Dajo City. Then he opened a noodle shop. The 1-year-old child would sometimes come to the noodle stall, but when business was good, he could only ask the old lady in the neighborhood to take care of him. The people in Dajo were as simple and reliable as the people around the Qing kingdom. However, the officials and bailiffs were not people. From ancient times until now, they had never been people. Thus, Gao Da's wrist that was picking noodles sank. His face was slightly lowered. Shrouded in the steam rising from the noodle pot, it was impossible to see the emotions in his eyes. The woman's face was flushed. It was a blush of embarrassment and anger. She listened to the increasingly filthy words in the shop. Tears of humiliation gradually rose in her eyes. She glanced at her husband beside noodle soup, hoping to see something. However, she didn't see anything. She was slightly disappointed and resigned to her fate. Before they got married, she knew that Brother Song was a timid person and an honest man who didn't say much more than she did. The silence of the noodle stall couple encouraged the bailiff's arrogance. Matters of the world were always like this. When one side oppressed the other, if there was no resistance, the power of the oppression would grow. One of the bailiffs stretched out his hand to grab the mute woman's small white and tender hand. She dodged it. The bailiffs became unhappy and began to curse. Gao Da tightened his grip on his chopsticks. However, he knew that he had to endure it. If anything happened, he and his wife would be wanted by the imperial court. Furthermore, he was, after all, an ace of the early royal court. He always had some confidence in the Qing officials. He always thought these bailiffs were just there to enjoy themselves and would leave later. However, these bailiffs did not leave. A high-ranking official from the Ministry of Justice was holding down the fort in Dajo. Supposedly, he was investigating a major case in secret. That was why he had chased the lower-ranking bailiffs out and forced them to walk arduously under the blazing sun. They hid in the shadow of the noodle shop and teased the beautiful but mute young lady. What a delightful thing it was. As for the man in the noodle stall, these bailiffs knew that although the man surnamed Song looked extremely sturdy, he was a piece of trash who couldn't even fart. Teasing the wife of a trash in front of his face, wouldn't that be even more delightful? The other people in the noodle shop saw that the situation was not right and had long snuck away. Before they left, they cast a sympathetic and warning gaze toward Gao Da. The people did not fight with officials. They didn't want the owner of the noodle shop to actually start a fight with the bailiffs. Gao Da didn't make a fuss. He just held his chopsticks and quietly called his wife back to the back of the shop. He then walked to the side of the table and awkwardly pushed up his cheeks. A smile that was uglier than crying rose to his face. He said a few words of flattery and begged for mercy. It was indeed very awkward. In this life, Gao Da had only flattered Fan Xian. Fan Xian thought his flattery wasn't good enough and stopped him from learning from Wang Qinian. From that day onwards, Gao Da no longer sucked up to anyone. Even a third-rank official had to be extremely courteous in front of him. To flatter and beg for mercy from these bailiffs was already the greatest concession Gao Da had made for his life. He had been messing around in the world for 3 years. Logically speaking, he should have learned some things. However, he was, after all, a tiger guard Gao Da with a knife in hand. He had defeated the enemy in one move in Shangjing. How could he truly break his pride and become a shrimp on the beach? Tiger guards were not guards. They were not there to serve people. They were there to kill people. The bailiffs suddenly felt that a mountain had appeared in front of them. It was the owner of the noodle shop. An imposing aura hit them in the face and made their teasing and obscenity stop abruptly. A moment later, they felt humiliated and angry because of their absent-mindedness. How could this honest person in front of them be so scared that they didn't dare to speak? It was clearly this Song guy who was bent over and smiling with all his might. Because of their humiliation and anger, they became more and more arrogant. They slammed the scabbards on the table with a deafening sound. Gao Da's eyes landed on their scabbards. He suddenly remembered that it had been a long time since he had touched a knife. He only held a pair of long black wooden chopsticks in his hands. He didn't make a sound and didn't resist. He allowed them to curse because he wanted to protect his wife and her child. He didn't want his wife and child to wander the world because of him. Even Gao Da himself didn't want to wander the world anymore. After escaping from Dong Mountain, he could have gone to Dongyi or Northern Qi, but he didn't want to. After all, he was a Qing person. He wanted to stay in the Qing kingdom, even if the place he stayed would still have officials like tigers and wolves and the unfairness of the world. Gao Da was enduring it with great difficulty. He was pretending to be weak and inexperienced. He suddenly heard a strange sound. Turning his head to look, he saw a drunk bailiff leaning against his wife's side. His hand was moving toward the round spot under the cloth skirt. Gao Da's hand holding the chopsticks tightened like he was holding a very long knife. His expression didn't change. His gaze remained calm. There was no longer any restraint or pretense. He didn't need to think about anything. He just followed his instincts that he hadn't seen for 3 years and naturally swung his knife forward. Just like how he had swung at Xiao En, the assassin, and the wind, the tiger guard used a long knife. In this life, he would only use the simplest method to cut through all the problems in front of him. Perhaps Gao Da had chosen the wrong path in the past 3 years. He was a saber wielder, not a subordinate. Gao Da seemed to have forgotten that he was not holding a knife in his hand but a pair of chopsticks as he swung down. The bailiffs were laughing loudly as they watched. In a moment they were going to ask their brother if the mute woman's butt was really that bouncy. Furthermore, they were going to take advantage of the chaos to go up and touch that but a few times after the song man was knocked to the ground. With a crack, the chopsticks broke. The entire noodle stall fell silent. The mute woman stared in a daze at the scene in front of her. Her pupils gradually constricted. She appeared terrified and shocked. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mouth gurgled. She wanted to cry out but she couldn't make a sound. The bailiffs in the noodle stall also stopped their laughter and all their actions. They just stared dumbly in that direction. A pair of black wooden chopsticks had been cut in two. One of the chopsticks had already slit the bailiff's throat like a sharp blade. The bailiff's chest was dripping with blood. His throat had been cut open by the chopsticks, revealing his windpipe and esophagus. There were also some unknown blood vessels. The bailiff stared with a pair of dead fish pearl-like eyes at Gao Da, who stood like a mountain in front of him. He slowly knelt down. Even in death, he did not understand why his throat had been cut open when he had only touched the woman's butt. He also did not understand how the pair of black chopsticks in the noodle stall owner's hands could be so sharp. Gao Da's hand, which held the chopsticks, was very steady. When the bailiff died in front of him, he no longer seemed to be a noodle stall owner, but an extremely terrifying swordsman. That familiar feeling returned to his body. He walked forward and gently hugged the woman. He quietly said something by her ear and furrowed his brows slightly. He knew he had struck too hard. This bailiff's crime was not worthy of death. He had revealed his hand. Under the investigation of the Qin kingdom's powerful state apparatus, people would probably find out about his past. However, Gao Da had not struck out in anger and could not control himself. In reality, he had only lightly waved the chopsticks. He had forgotten that he was an ace at the peak of the 8th level. He had also forgotten that the people making trouble in the noodle stall were not enemies of the Juanshan Conference or the Northern Qi Brocade Guard. They were just some hateful, shameful, and pitiful bailiffs. It was just a misunderstanding, a fatal misunderstanding. Gao Da had overestimated these bailiffs, so he had easily killed a person. When the other bailiffs in the noodle stall saw this, their bodies trembled. They didn't know who the owner of the noodle stall was. They were even more shocked by this bloody scene. After a long while, one of the more timid bailiffs finally screamed. "Who is it?" The scream brought everyone back to their senses. They would rather die than believe that there was someone in this world who could use a pair of chopsticks to kill someone. They thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. Perhaps the noodle stall owner had hidden some weapon earlier and caused their brother's death. One of the bailiffs secretly slipped away to report to the government. Under the lead of a small leader, the others pulled out the knives on the table and charged toward Gao Da with a loud yell. Gao Da lowered his head and explained something to his wife. The chopsticks in his hand had already fallen to the ground. He found that his wife was terrified. His hand reached into the wind of knives and snatched a knife. Very casually he swung it out. There was a clanging sound, a bloody wind, and a bloody mist. The bailiffs had no power to retaliate. Their heads and bodies fell into the noodle stall. All of the bailiffs were dead. They died cleanly. Half covered in blood, Gouda held a knife in one hand and supported his wife with the other as he walked out of the noodle stall. It shocked the people on the street into an uproar. Like the tide, they parted to form a path. He knew he had to leave Dazhou as soon as possible and had to hurry. Killing these bailiffs was nothing because he was called Gouda, the leader of the Tiger Guards. He had always been a weapon for killing. His past life and history meant that he could not stay in the noodle stall forever. However, now that he had a wife and a child, he did not want to die under the pursuit of the court, so he had to escape with all his might. Under the scorching sun, Gouda and his wife embarked on the road of escape after killing people on the street. The couple did not say anything. They rushed home as soon as possible, picked up their son from the hands of the neighbor's aunt, and then picked up some money, preparing to leave the city. Along the way, the mute woman did not say a word, but her stubborn and beautiful face was full of trust and admiration for the man. She was willing to follow him. Under the scorching sun, Gouda held the child, held the knife, looked at his wife, and thought of the future wandering in Jianghu. A strong sense of apology and uneasiness welled up in his heart. He said softly, "Wife, I owe you too much." However, the government of Dazhou reacted faster than ever. Before Gouda had a chance to make up for the debt in his heart, the city gate of Dazhou had already been tightly closed. Everyone probably knows that Saling has created a web-based game, Twilight of the Gods. Many people play there. For the specific introduction of the game, everyone can go to the website to take a look. At 14 o'clock on November 26th, the new Dirty Universe opened. Chapter 684. Gouda's luck was not good. It should be said to be very bad. He knew that a bailiff had secretly slipped away from the noodle stall, but he didn't care because most bailiffs were cowards who were afraid of death. Moreover, in his judgment, a mere province couldn't possibly produce any extraordinary figures. His and the mute woman's reactions could be considered quick. They returned to the courtyard, picked up the child, and headed toward the city gates. It was impossible for the government to react. When he was about half a li away from the city gates, he heard the heavy sound of the city gates closing, as well as chaotic shouts and nervous dispatches. Gouda's eyes were wide open as he looked at the distant city gates and the increasing number of bailiffs gathering there. His heart grew cold as he felt great shock and surprise. He turned his head and glanced at the woman beside him. Her earlier movements had been too rushed. There was sweat on the woman's temples. Her face was flushed red, and her clear eyes were filled with terror and unease. Gouda patted her hand and said in a low voice, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." The mute woman's mouth was half open as she nodded. She thought that her husband had killed a bailiff and was going against the court. Her family of 3 would probably not be able to survive. A trace of bitterness rose in her heart and seeped into her eyes. It looked very sorrowful. No one knew where the city gates had received the order, but they tightly closed the city gates and did not expand the scope of the search. Thus it gave Gouda some time to react. He furrowed his brows. Holding the child and the mute woman's hand, he walked toward the residential area in the back. In a moment he disappeared into Dazhou. Gouda's luck was very bad because a member of the Ministry of Justice's Special Division had chosen to gather in Dazhou. Coincidentally, this Special Division member had been sent by the great scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zongwei. He was investigating Tiger Guard Gouda, who might have escaped from Dong Mountain. He Zongwei had maintained peace in Jingdo these months because he knew that even with his power and connections in court and the emperor's favor, it was not enough to shake Fan Xian's position. Thus he had been carrying out that matter in secret. He wanted to use Wang Qinian or Gouda to open up this opening. However, after months of investigation, Wang Qinian of the Overwatch Council still did not have a single clue. Even though it was clear that Lao Wang was hiding with his entire family, the Special Case Department could not find any breakthrough. On the contrary, under the powerful pressure and support He Zongwei exerted, the Ministry of Justice officials began to investigate the minute details at the foot of Dong Mountain. They faintly touched upon Gouda's escape route. In the end, they locked onto a possible hiding spot in one of the 7 provincial counties south of Dongshan Road and north of Jiangbei Road. Dazhou was one of them. In the vast sea of people, it was extremely difficult to find an ace that everyone thought was dead. Moreover, it was impossible to issue an arrest warrant for this matter. Thus, the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice had been searching the 7 provincial cities and the surrounding villages for the past 6 months like searching for a needle in a haystack. However, they still hadn't found him. Other than the aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice, there were also a few aces of the internal court that He Zongwei had sent. Although the Qing Emperor had given this power to He Zongwei to protect his personal safety, He Zongwei had already placed all of his chips on Wang Qinian and Gouda. Thus he had sent all of them. Seeing that Dongyi had been leveled and Fan Xian was about to return, Scholar he still did not hear any good news from his subordinates. Thus he began to feel anxious. Although he maintained a calm and warm expression in front of his subordinates, in his private orders, he began to exert powerful pressure. The aces of the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice were almost driven crazy by this pressure. They had gathered in Dazhou to exchange the information in their hands and to communicate with each other. They hoped to be able to find the Tiger Guard who had already disappeared. Coincidentally, the bailiffs they had sent into the city to check the household records were slacking off and entered a noodle shop. The owner of the noodle shop rose up and killed someone. Before the bailiffs who had slipped away could return to the Dazhou government, they first saw the sinister-looking and unreachable officials of the 13 yamens. In his terror, the bailiffs reported what had happened in the noodle shop to these officials from Jingdo. The officials of the Ministry of Justice, who were about to go crazy from Scholar He's pressure, felt a buzzing in their heads. Although they couldn't confirm who the owner of the noodle stall was, the criminal investigation officials' extremely sensitive intuition and powerful execution allowed them to immediately bypass the jurisdiction of the Dazhou government and directly give the order to close the city gates. Gao Da's family of 3 was sealed inside Dazhou. After a night of light, the officials of the Ministry of Justice had already confirmed the identity of the noodle shop owner. Regardless of whether it was the chopsticks broken in 2 or the wound of the bailiffs who had been decapitated, it all showed that this person had brilliant knife skills and ruthless attacks. How could an ace of this realm be hiding in a small city selling noodles? There was definitely something fishy going on. The officials of the 13 yamens were all very nervous. Torches were lit all around the noodle shop, illuminating everything inside. They thought to themselves, after working hard for more than a year, they should have finally found the right person, right? The fiery red light shone on the faces of all the officials of the Ministry of Justice. They stared nervously and excitedly at the ace of the internal court in the noodle shop, hoping to receive his final confirmation. The pale-faced ace of the internal court gently used his fingertips to press down on the broken part of the chopsticks. After a moment of silence, he nodded. The officials of the Ministry of Justice met each other's eyes. They couldn't hold back the joy in their eyes. In order to investigate this groundless court criminal, they had endured too much pressure from Scholar He. Furthermore, it was a matter without any foundation. They had run around the 7 roads of the Qing kingdom for an entire year before finally placing their target near Dazhou. They had not expected their luck to be so good. Their target had jumped out on its own so quickly. The ace of the internal court was directly under He Zongwei's command. However, he had risen and fallen in the palace these years. He didn't know why Scholar He wanted to investigate this matter. He only knew that the escaped noodle shop owner was probably the only Tiger Guard left in the world. A glimmer of worry flashed through his old face. He didn't know what kind of danger was hidden behind this matter. The old people in the palace all knew that the Tiger Guards were vicious people that Minister Fan had single-handedly trained. The Emperor had used the Dong Mountain incident to cut off all of Minister Fan's powerful wings. How could there still be one left in Dazhou? The eyes of the internal court ace suddenly lit up. He wondered if Scholar He had received the Emperor's secret edict, which was why he had gone through so much trouble to find this person. What about Sir Fan Jr.? If the news of this person's survival was known by Sir Fan Jr., what would the consequences be? These were things that only major figures had to consider. They were only officials and subordinates. They acted according to orders. Since it was a court criminal who had escaped before the battle, he had to be captured. The internal court ace looked at the joy in the official's eyes and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He thought to himself that these officials probably didn't know how terrifying the Tiger Guards were. Particularly, a Tiger Guard who had learned to escape before the battle. The city had been sealed for an entire day and night. The Dazhou Zhizhou also learned of this matter. Although he was angry that some unruly commoners had dared to kill his own bailiffs, compared to such a major matter as sealing the city, he was more angry for some unknown reason. These people from the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice dared to interfere with local politics. Did they not understand that once the city was sealed, the people in Dazhou would have a hard time living? After the 13 yamans of the Ministry of Justice revealed the secret order from the Hall of Governmental Affairs and the identity of the internal court ace to the Zhizhou, he immediately fell silent like a quail. He knew that the noodle stall owner was not only a court criminal but also had a terrifying background, which was why so many people from Jingdo had come to capture him. The Dazhou Zhizhou immediately expressed his attitude. He mobilized all of the officials and bailiffs in the provincial yamen and began to cooperate with the officials from the Ministry of Justice from Jingdo to sort through the city. All of the local elders in charge were also mobilized. In a place like the Qing Kingdom, once the local government mobilized all of its power, it was not difficult to find a few people in the city. Since the criminal had a wife and child, he had to sleep, eat, and interact with people. The officials of the Ministry of Justice were very satisfied with the strength of Dazhou's cooperation. They believed that in at most 2 days, they would be able to force the criminal out of the private residence in Dazhou. Gauda, who had been hiding in the private residence, had not eaten for a day and night. He carefully hid his tracks and only took a risk to steal a few pieces of clothing and some food and water for the child. The tiger guards had never received training in hiding. After following Fan Xian for a few years, if Gauda truly hid by himself, it would probably be difficult for anyone to find him. Just as the government had judged, he had a wife and child by his side. This was the most troublesome matter. The mute woman's spirit had been tortured to the point where it was almost unbearable. Her large eyes were full of sorrow. Gauda knew that if the government wanted to find the 3 of them, it would take at most 2 days. After thinking for a long time, he decided to take the initiative and break out. The time to break out was chosen at dusk, the time when people most easily relaxed. This was also the first day after the noodle stand murder. In the blood-like dusk, Gauda, with a cloth chain tied to his chest and the child tied to his chest, held his wife's hand and slowly walked toward the city gate. He thought for a long time and still could not think of a way to take his family over the tall city walls, so he could only choose to force his way through. He walked step by step toward the city gate. The soldiers and bailiffs at the gate were nervously watching the people going in and out. Although the city was sealed in name, in reality, the villagers responsible for carrying water and bringing in vegetables could still enter and leave the city. However, the security here was very strict. It felt even stricter than in Jingdo. A few officials of the Ministry of Justice from Jingdo held a portrait and coldly and meticulously examined everyone's appearance. As he got closer and closer to the city gate, Gauda felt that his hands were slightly wet. It was not from his nervousness but from his wife's hands. He turned his head to glance at the mute woman and found that her body was already trembling. It looked like he would not be able to hide it from the sensitive officials of the Ministry of Justice at the city gate. Gauda sighed in his heart. Of course, he had never thought about sneaking out. The family of 3 stood in front of the city gate in front of the officials of the Ministry of Justice, bailiffs and soldiers. They were only 27 feet away from the line that led out of the city. Outside the city gate, there was a donkey cart carrying vegetables. Gauda's eyes were fixed on the donkey cart. The city has been sealed. No one is allowed to enter or leave, a soldier said in a loud voice to Gauda. It was clear that these 3 people could not be farmers outside the city. The aces of the 13 yamans of the Ministry of Justice narrowed their eyes. They looked at the family close at hand. Their pupils gradually constricted. The portrait in their hands gradually fell to the ground. Their hands slowly moved toward the hilt of their knives. It was too easy to recognize. They recognized at a glance that the newcomer was the court criminal they had been chasing for a year. They had jumped out of their own accord and come to the city gate. Did they want to kill their way out of the city gate? The aces of the Ministry of Justice slowly walked out from everywhere and gradually surrounded the family of 3. Before the encirclement had even closed in, Gauda had already raised his face and calmly glanced at the nearest ace of the Ministry of Justice. There was no emotion in his eyes, only coldness. Surrender. The ace of the Ministry of Justice suddenly felt a wave of danger coming at him. He roared loudly and pulled out the knife at his waist at the same time. Surrender. He only had time to say the first 2 words. The second 2 words were drowned out by a spray of blood. In a flash, Gauda took 2 quick steps forward. His hand moved like a dragon and slashed at the ace's wrist. The ace of the Ministry of Justice had no time to react. He could only quickly retreat. But just as his wrist was still swinging in the air, it broke with a crack. Gauda snatched the knife and swung down with his elbow, leaving behind a smear of blood and the collapsed body of the ace of the Ministry of Justice. He then retreated to the mute woman's side and looked coldly at the aces and soldiers of the Ministry of Justice charging at him. There was no trace of fear or self-doubt. There was only great confidence. With a knife in hand, who could stop him? The knife flashed. Gao Da held the knife and charged toward the city gate with his wife and child. There was no one in front of the knife. Every time the knife came out, someone would die. He used the blood and the sound of the wind to open a path. In an instant he was about to break through the city gate. This was victory in the word courage. In an instant he stunned the hearts of all the officials of the Ministry of Justice. They looked at the powerful figure and found it difficult to surround him. The distance of 70 feet was not far, and the car was not far either. Gao Da's body and face were already stained with a lot of blood. His hand was still tightly holding onto his mute wife, carefully protecting her. The price he paid was a few more wounds on his body. The aces of the 13 Yamans were indeed powerful, but they were not as terrifying as Gao Da's bravery. Gao Da roared. Like a blood dragon, he shattered the combined attack of the 3 aces in front of him. The knife shattered into countless pieces. He used these pieces to open a path and charged out of the city. At this moment, a palm pressed down in the dusk. It came from the direction of the carriage and slapped toward his face. Gao Da gave a muffled grunt. He lowered his waist to the ground and threw out a punch. The fist and palm collided. Wind and smoke rose up outside the city gate. When the smoke fell, the ace from the internal court looked at him in a daze and said, "Gao Da, you really didn't die." Chapter 685. After I finished writing in the afternoon, the website crashed. I couldn't update it no matter what. Then I had an urgent matter to attend to and had to leave today, so I sent the contents of the chapter to Thee and asked him to help me update it. I didn't expect to come back and find that there were no updates. I'm truly sorry. Gao Da's pupils constricted slightly as he stared at the eunuch in front of him. He had carried out secret guard work for the royal family for many years. Of course, he recognized the ace of the internal court in front of him. For a moment he wondered if Eunuch Yao had also come to Dazhou. He took a deep breath. Although he would not be afraid even if Eunuch Yao came personally, he knew that the palace had certainly found out about his whereabouts. The difficulties he was about to face must be terrifying. The eunuch coughed gently and took out a cloth from his clothes to wipe away the blood at the corners of his lips. In a raspy voice he said, "Eunuch Yao did not come. This is a matter for the court. I am now working for Scholar He." Gao Da glanced at him and cautiously took half a step back. His gaze swept around and his grip on his mute wife's hand tightened. Hearing the eunuch's words, he finally knew that there were people in court who did not believe he had died and had been investigating this matter in secret. 2 more eunuchs walked out from the shadows by the city gate. Gao Da stared at the eunuch in the lead and said, "You are not a match for me." The 3 aces of the internal court were silent, particularly the one in front. His emotions were unusually complicated. This time, they had followed the aces of the Ministry of Justice's 13 Yamans to Dazhou to do business. They faintly knew that Scholar He was investigating the omissions from the Dong Mountain incident 3 years ago. This eunuch had not thought that he would actually find Gao Da, this tiger guard. The officials of the Ministry of Justice had already surrounded them. Other than those who had been injured by Gao Da's knife, there were dozens of people. Looking at the situation, even if Gao Da grew wings, he would not be able to fly out. The eunuch coughed again. When he had exchanged blows with Gao Da earlier, his internal strength had rebounded and he had already been injured. The gaze he looked at Gao Da with fear and admiration. "I didn't expect you to actually be alive. I also didn't expect you to not fall behind all these years." The eunuch's gaze was a bit muddy but carried a ruthless coldness. "Since I was lucky to run into you today, don't think about leaving." As if his face had changed, the eunuch's expression suddenly became cold and grim. Gao Da had long gotten used to the way the internal court did things. He only looked at him calmly and said, "If you want to keep me here, you will probably have to pay a great price. We are not afraid of paying the price." The eunuch glanced at the beautiful woman beside him and said with a strange smile, "However, the price you will pay may not be something you can bear. Just surrender. You know you have no way out, so why drag others down?" The eunuch said gently. At this moment, the sun had already set, leaving behind a wisp of helpless twilight that enveloped the city gate. It was drowsy and caused one to feel drowsy. A hint of struggle and sorrow flashed through Gao Da's eyes. After a moment of silence, he faintly said, "If I'm captured by you, I won't be able to live. Does that mean she will be able to live?" The eunuch lowered his head and said a moment later, "Adults naturally have to pay for their actions. As for whether the child on your chest is dead or alive, only the palace can decide." "Then why shouldn't I? You don't have to die right now. You can live a few more days." As for this child, perhaps after that young man learns of this matter, he will be willing to protect it for you." The eunuch glanced at him meaningfully. "Young man?" A glimmer of confusion flashed through Gao Da's eyes. If Sir Fan Jr. knew he was still alive in this world, was surrounded by people outside the Dazhou city gate, and knew he had a child in his arms, what would he do? He had committed the crime of deceiving the ruler, so there was no reason for him to escape. However, Sir Fan Jr. should be able to protect the child in his arms, right? The officials of the Ministry of Justice all maintained their silence. The gaze they looked at the knife-wielding man carried a glimmer of fear. In the battle at the city gate earlier, in just a few breaths, 6 of their colleagues had died tragically to that blade light. They knew this knife-wielding man with his wife and child was the legendary Tiger Guard, the Tiger Guard who had fought Sigu Jian to the death on Dong Mountain. They had already surrounded him, so why didn't they immediately charge forward and cut him to pieces? Everyone had this impulse because of the unease in their hearts. However, they knew that Scholar He's secret investigation this time would ultimately rely on these 3 internal court aces. The other party had not spoken to attack, so it was best for them to remain silent. Perhaps it was because he saw Gao Da struggling and hesitating that the expression of the internal court ace gradually darkened. In a stern voice he said, "You were a Tiger Guard of the royal family. You fled on Dong Mountain and abandoned the ruler. This is seen as treason. If you still don't kneel, do you want to continue rebelling?" Gao Da's face became deathly pale. Sigu Jian's sword had attacked from the sky on Dong Mountain. The limbs of his comrades below the long stone steps had been sent flying. Fresh blood flowed between the mountain rocks. These scenes reappeared in front of his eyes. He was the commander of the Tiger Guards and a well-known figure among the hundreds of Tiger Guards. Ever since he was young, he had been instilled with the idea of loyalty to the ruler and patriotism. He was willing to die for the emperor. However, Gao Da had followed Fan Xian for 3 whole years. His horizons had gradually widened. Most importantly, his personality and outlook on life had been greatly influenced by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had always been a gentle person. The small details of his daily life and the taste in his words were enough to affect too many people by his side. Thus, Gao Da was the first Tiger Guard in history to flee on the eve of battle. The ace of the internal court had brought up the Dong Mountain incident to weaken his fighting spirit. The deathly pale color on Gao Da's face did not remain for long. It gradually returned to normal. He stared at the other party with a chill and said, "Abandon the ruler? Abandon the ruler?" When he had made up his mind to flee Dong Mountain, Gao Da had struggled in his heart. However, during these 3 years of wandering among the Qing people, his thoughts and his dreams at night, and the rumors he had heard, they had made him think about the events of the past countless times. His voice became sharp and cold like a knife. He angrily said, "Was it me who abandoned the emperor, or was it the emperor who abandoned me?" On Dong Mountain, 100 Tiger Guards all died at the hands of the enemy for the sake of exhausting Sigu Jian's killing intent. Gao Da grew angry. His voice grew louder as his eyes widened in anger. "I am a Tiger Guard. I am willing to use my life to protect the emperor's safety, but I am not willing to throw my life away for some **t reason. Even if I die, I want to die knowing the reason." Gao Da's hand slowly tightened around the hilt of his knife and pulled the mute woman behind him. Glaring at the ace of the internal court, he enunciated each word clearly, "I just don't want to die like those companions of mine who are useless and muddle-headed. What is wrong with that?" The ace's voice grew sharp and trembled. It was as if he had not expected to hear this Tiger Guard say such treasonous words outside Dazhou city gates. He cursed angrily in a sharp voice, "If the emperor wants the official to die, the official has no choice but to die. As a Tiger Guard, how could you say such treasonous words? You are truly incorrigible. I've already done treasonous things. What's there to say?" At this moment, Gao Da suddenly felt his entire body relax. He had finally vented all of his resentment toward the emperor. Yes, the Tiger Guards were only death fighters raised by the royal family, but Gao Da was already an independent person. He did not want to live muddle-headed and die muddle-headed. Gao Da used strips of cloth to tightly tie the mute woman to his back. His hands forcefully tightened the lines. As he did this, no one at the city gates moved. They all waited nervously for the ace of the internal court to speak. "If you continue to defy the edict, don't you think that Sir Fan Jr. will be dragged down by you?" The ace's hands slowly trembled. He was gathering his energy. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said something that pierced straight into Gao Da's heart. Gao Da laughed coldly and said, "Who is Fan Xian?" If he's dragged down, then he's dragged down. Is there anyone good in this world? The ace's expression changed slightly. It was as if he had not expected Gowda to say such a thing. Did he not have any affection for Sir Fan Jr. anymore? Of course, the truth of the matter was not like this. When the ace said that he was not under Eunuch Yao's orders to capture him, Gowda knew that there was something fishy about this matter. After hearing Scholar He's name, Gowda immediately knew what he wanted to do. More accurately, he knew what he wanted to do. Regardless of whether it was in court or among the Qing people, everyone knew that in the Qing court, Sir Fan Jr. had been suppressing Scholar He with all his strength. Scholar He, relying on his royal favor, was also fighting desperately against Sir Fan Jr. The two sides were like fire and water. However, under the Emperor's suppression, there was no chance for them to explode. Gowda knew that given Sir Fan Jr.'s ability and strength, it was impossible for He Zongwei to find a way to defeat him. There did not seem to be a single hole in Sir Fan Jr.'s body. Unexpectedly, he who had escaped from Dong Mountain and survived, was without question, a hole in Fan Xian's plan. He Zongwei only wanted to capture Gowda or Wang Qinian. He didn't want these two people to die. As long as he captured Gowda, it would be like he had captured one of Fan Xian's tails, even though Fan Xian didn't know he had a tail. Gowda lifted his wife's body up. The murderous intent in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. He stared at the ace and didn't say a word. If he was captured alive by the court and used by He Zongwei to defeat Sir Fan Jr., what kind of harm would that cause? Gowda had followed Fan Xian for too long and understood him well. Sir Fan Jr. appeared cold and heartless, but he was actually a very protective person. This kind of protection was different from Director Chen's. Fan Xian would give his truest concern to the people close to him. If the court captured him, Sir Fan Jr. would probably risk a taboo to rescue him. Gowda did not want Sir Fan Jr. to sink into a dangerous situation for him, so he decided to fight to the death and not surrender. He would rather die in front of Dazhou city gates than surrender without a fight. He also did not want to drag him down for a few more days. However, he had wronged the wife behind him and the child in front of him. A glimmer of hopelessness flashed through Gowda's eyes, as well as a deep sense of guilt. Holding the knife in his hand, he roared and charged forward. There was no end to killing people. There would always be a moment when a knife would break. How could one person oppose the powerful machinery of a country? Although Gowda was valiant, he was not a great grandmaster. Under the powerful pursuit of the Qing court, it was already particularly terrifying that he could last until nightfall. Soaked in blood and exhausted, he only managed to charge 3 li out of Dazhou. The Ministry of Justice aces and soldiers who had surrounded him cleverly maintained their distance and only attacked in batches. They did not allow the situation to become so chaotic that Gowda had any chance to break out of the encirclement. There were torches all around, scattered all around the road. They looked brighter than the stars in the sky. The ace looked coldly at the pursuit on the road in front of him, judging when Gowda would run out of energy. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Have the children be careful. Don't just attack the woman on his back." An official of the Ministry of Justice was slightly shocked. Turning his head to glance at him, he asked, "Sir, why is that?" In the eyes of these officials, although Tiger Guard Gowda was more powerful than they had imagined, he had a child in his arms and a woman on his back. As long as the tip of the knife pointed toward those places, he would always have some fear and be injured more. The ace slowly walked toward the center of the battle. As he walked, he coughed. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "If we really accidentally kill that woman once Gowda goes crazy, how can we capture him alive? As long as that woman is alive, she is as heavy as a mountain for Gowda. Even if he wants to commit suicide, he will have to think about it a bit longer." Even now, this ace still wanted to capture Gowda alive. After all, this was something Scholar he had requested countless times. If Gowda died, how could he threaten Fan Xian? He Zongwei was still hoping to use Gowda to provoke the relationship between Fan Xian and the Emperor. This ace could not guess. No one knew how many people Gowda had killed. He was like a mad tiger and covered in blood. 2 of the 3 internal court aces had already been heavily injured by his heavy blows. Many officials of the Ministry of Justice had also died to his knife. However, his knife was gradually cracking. The Jinchi in his body was about to be exhausted. Everyone could see that after the court had paid the price of dozens of lives, this vicious imperial criminal was finally about to collapse. Everyone let out a breath in their hearts. The Ministry of Justice's special anesthetic began to be applied to the blade of the knife, preparing to carry out the final work of closing the net. A row of black carriages came from the other end of the road. This group of carriages was very strange. It was serene and dark like people had come from the underworld. The group of carriages was very long and seemed to have no end in sight. Gowda chopped off the right arm of an ace from the 13 yamans to his right. Suddenly he felt his left knee soften. He knew that he was at the end of his rope. With an unwilling howl, he charged toward the group of carriages. The pursuing officials were not nervous. They were also not worried about whether or not the group of carriages would be caught in the crossfire. They continued to move forward at a leisurely pace. In the black carriages, the Overwatch Council official was talking to the old man inside the curtain. He saw the city full of lights and a bloody man. His gaze became complicated. It was not until the bloody man ran close that the Overwatch Council official saw clearly that there were actually 3 people in this bloody man. The Overwatch Council official floated over and caught the bloody man the moment he fell to the ground. His brows twitched. In a raspy voice, he suppressed his excitement and said, "Gowda, you've gotten a wife." The knife in Gowda's hand was stuck into the ground. He was about to take this person hostage when he suddenly heard this joke. Raising his head, he saw a stranger. Chapter 686. The black group of carriages was surrounded by twinkling torches that lit up the road. However, the group was too long. Even though the Dajo Yamen had come out in full force, the aces from the 13 Yamens led by the 3 internal court eunuchs could only cut off half of the group of carriages. They had no way of surrounding the entire group. However, these officials' eyes were fixed on the court criminal. They were not worried that this bloody man with his wife and child would disappear from their sight. However, no one dared to rush forward and grab the Gundam. This was because everyone sensed something strange. The person carrying the criminal was clearly not an ordinary person. The official robes he wore were somewhat familiar to everyone. Most importantly, this long group of black carriages. Although the style of the carriages looked normal, a group of over 30 carriages was not a sight that could be seen at any time. Even the stupidest person could guess that there were important figures in the group. The officials of the 13 offices of the Ministry of Justice secretly spat and cursed their bad luck. They had never thought that they would run into such a strange group of carriages outside the remote Dajo city. They had just been extremely lucky and had finally captured a criminal of the imperial court that the court had been secretly searching for a long time. The officials of the Ministry of Justice did not panic. Although they temporarily did not know the identity of this group of carriages, they were acting on the orders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. They could be considered half an imperial mission. Who in the world dared to stop them? Even if the people in this group of black carriages were nobles in the court, they could not criticize the court's actions in capturing a criminal. 3 internal court eunuchs walked out of the crowd surrounded by torches. The old eunuch at the front narrowed his eyes and looked at the strange group of carriages. He looked at the court criminal covered in blood lying on the flat ground in front of the carriage. A few people in black official robes seemed to be treating him. The mute woman with a deathly pale face was holding her child and looking nervously at the criminal. The internal court ace's eyes narrowed. His nose twitched slightly. He felt a glimmer of surprise and unease. He had easily recognized the people in black official robes in the carriages and which side they belonged to. During the battle, although Gowda had bravely charged onto the road and heavily injured 2 internal court aces, he himself was at the end of his strength. He had to protect the wife on his back and the child in his arms. There were many wounds on his body that should not have appeared. The internal court ace who was in charge of the arrest also felt his chi and blood churn. He could not calm down for a moment. He looked at the convoy in front of him and frowned slightly. Of course he wouldn't be too arrogant. He was just a little afraid. As an internal court ace with orders from the emperor, even if this group of carriages truly belonged to the Overwatch Council, he had nothing to be afraid of. The problem was he didn't know the rank of this group of carriages in the Overwatch Council. Most importantly, the criminal the court wanted was Tiger Guard Gowda, who had once been Sir Fan Jr.'s trusted bodyguard. If the Overwatch Council discovered this and Sir Fan Jr. was in this group of carriages, the eunuch took a deep breath and slowly walked forward under the light of the torch. Facing the pure black carriage on the road, he said in a raspy voice, "Internal Court Hichigan has come by imperial edict to capture a criminal." He didn't first ask about the identity of this group of carriages. Instead, he took the initiative to state his identity and purpose of coming. Thus, if the black group of carriages made any strange movements, the internal court would have a head start. The aces of the 13 Yamens of the Ministry of Justice gradually realized that something was wrong. They were no longer as confident as before. Instead, they spread out warily around the carriage. However, the soldiers of the Dajo Yamen were confused. These men from Jingdo all had their eyes on top of their heads. Even when faced with the court criminal who was like a vicious tiger, no one would take a step back. Why were they so cautious when faced with this black group of carriages? Criminal? The Overwatch Council official squatting by Gao Da's side and tending to his injuries suddenly furrowed his brows. Hearing the internal court eunuch's words, a complicated emotion suddenly flashed through his eyes. Gazing at the unconscious Gao Da, he muttered to himself in a low voice, "So, you also slipped away back then." The internal court eunuch did not receive a reply, but this was within his expectations. The Overwatch Council's actions had always been secretive. Once they went up against the major yamens of the court, they became unusually arrogant and unreasonable. Although the internal court had the function of supervising the Overwatch Council in name, with the deliberate connivance of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, the previous two directors, the Overwatch Council was not very afraid of the internal court. Which official of the council is in the group of carriages? Is there something important? The internal court eunuch's eyelids drooped slightly. Coldly he said, "Please hand this criminal to the internal court to deal with." There were more than 30 carriages. No one knew how many officials, secret agents, or important items they carried. For the Overwatch Council to pull out more than 30 specially made carriages, if they were not protecting a particularly important person in the council, then they were responsible for a very important mission. Although this eunuch was an ace of the internal court, he did not want to affect the Overwatch Council's affairs. He was particularly afraid that his luck would be so bad that he would run into Sir Fan Jr. outside Dajo. The Overwatch Council official crouching by Gao Da's side slowly rose. Facing the blinding light of the torch, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the internal court ace. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "I am the deputy head of the second bureau of the Overwatch Council. Please show me your edict." The internal court eunuch's temple suddenly throbbed with a burning sensation. He had not thought that after he and his group had revealed their identities, this Overwatch Council official would still want to see the edict he carried with him. The Overwatch Council was not afraid of the internal court, and the internal court was even less afraid of the Overwatch Council. They were only afraid of the two directors of the Overwatch Council. In front of the Emperor, these two directors carried more weight than the entire internal court combined. Thus, in their daily interactions, the internal court was polite to the Overwatch Council, and the Overwatch Council did not want to offend the internal court. For this Overwatch Council official to say such a thing in a situation like this, it appeared incomparably tyrannical. Involuntarily, it made the internal court eunuch's heart tremble. This was very different from the Overwatch Council's usual style. Was there really? Is Sir Fan Jr. in the carriages? Please allow me to come forward and pay my respects. The internal court eunuch gritted his teeth. Although the Overwatch Council was powerful, he was not afraid. He was only afraid that Sir Fan Jr. was truly in the carriages. Otherwise, why would this official be so cold and stubborn? The director is currently working in Dongyi. The Overwatch Council official furrowed his brows and glanced at him. It was as if he had not expected the other party to start probing so quickly. Coldly he said, "Since we are all working for the court, is there a problem with me wanting to see your seal?" Hearing that Fan Xian was not in the carriages, the internal court eunuch's heart immediately calmed. Although the Overwatch Council was terrifying, it was, after all, the Emperor's special forces. They did not have the courage to stop the internal court from doing things. When does the internal court need to report to the Overwatch Council for internal court matters? The internal court eunuch's face gradually darkened. In a raspy voice he said, "Someone take this court criminal into custody." After giving this order, his eyes moved to the face of the deputy head of the second bureau. His gaze seemed to be tangible as he tried to intimidate him. At this moment, the internal court was working with the 13 yamens. If the Overwatch Council insisted on forcefully interfering, what was the difference between that and rebellion? During this year, he had been sent by the Emperor to serve under scholar He and endlessly pursued Gao Da through the mountains and fields of the Qin kingdom. He had never returned to Jingdo, so he did not know much about the Overwatch Council. He only knew that Sir Fan Jr. had indeed been busy with the matter of Dongyi submitting. He didn't know who this black carriage might be carrying. The aces of the Ministry of Justice's 13 yamens met each other's eyes. They all saw the wariness and unease in each other's eyes. They knew that everyone in the carriage was an official of the Overwatch Council. The officials of the 6 ministries and 3 temples all had an innate fear and resistance toward the Overwatch Council. Normally, these officials of the Ministry of Justice would not, no matter what, directly oppose the Overwatch Council. However, they were working for the court. Furthermore, Countless eyes were looking at the blood-soaked criminal lying among the Overwatch Council officials. They were much more confident than before. The officials of the Ministry of Justice slowly and steadily moved toward the side of the carriage. The Overwatch Council officials beside the carriage did not make any movements. It was as if they also felt that they shouldn't fall out with the entire internal court and the Ministry of Justice for a court criminal. The people surrounding them all let out a breath at the same time. They watched as a few officials of the Ministry of Justice had already walked to Tiger Guard Gao Da's side. They took out the shackles and were preparing to put on the shackles. The Overwatch Council official, who had been silent and furrowed his brows the entire time, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "That's still not right. If you say he's a court criminal, then he's a court criminal? You're a eunuch of the internal court, not an official of the Supreme Court." Immediately after, he waved his hand. A number of cold lights flashed. The Overwatch Council officials around Gao Da still had their hands behind their backs and did not move. From the darkness around the carriage, a few swordsmen swept out like a gust of wind. In a flash, they drew their swords and placed them across the necks of the officials of the Ministry of Justice. The faces of the officials of the Ministry of Justice immediately paled. They had been careful the entire time. They had not expected that such powerful aces were hidden in the seemingly distant darkness around the road illuminated by the torches. Before they could even make a move, they had been subdued by the other party. The internal court ace slowly raised his head and narrowed his eyes. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the movement in front of him. He looked at the swordsman completely shrouded in black clothing and couldn't help but feel a glimmer of coldness. The assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council truly lived up to their reputation. However, he was not afraid at all. Looking at the deputy head of the 2nd Bureau, he coldly said, "It looks like you also know the identity of this criminal and that he was Director Fan's trusted aide. What was killing people?" This was killing people. The hundreds of people present all heard these words. No one could kill everyone to silence them. As long as the Overwatch Council stopped the internal court from capturing this criminal, then the rumors added to Fan Xian's name would naturally travel to Jingdo. The Overwatch Council official lowered his head slightly and thought for a moment. He then said, "Stupid old eunuch, I don't care what you say. You said you were acting by imperial edict, so I want to see your seal. Even if you don't have it, you still have to show me the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice. Otherwise, if I say you are a bandit who has brought disaster to your village, what excuse do you have?" After saying this, a cold smile rose to the corners of the official's lips. He appeared icy and confident. Standing behind everyone, the Dajo Zhizhou was the highest-ranking official. However, he knew that there was something fishy about this matter. Furthermore, it involved the Overwatch Council, the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Internal Court and the Ministry of Justice. As a mere Zhizhou of a small province, how could he involve himself in this? Hearing about the bandit, the Zhizhou couldn't help but smile bitterly. The people of the Overwatch Council were indeed shameless and ruthless. In front of so many court officials, they dared to call an internal court eunuch a bandit. Capturing Gao Da and Wang Qinian had always been a secret matter that He Zhongwei had secretly carried out. He wanted to hide this matter until the end so that once the conflict between the Emperor and Fan Xian exploded, there would be no chance to turn it around. Thus, he had not reported it to the Emperor ahead of time. Of course, it was impossible for him to have the Emperor's personal seal. Furthermore, he did not dare to let Fan Xian's powerful subordinates know of his plans. Thus, everything was done in secret. There wasn't even a Ministry of Justice wanted notice. If he captured Gao Da or Wang Qinian, it would be easy to make up for these procedures later. However, the Overwatch Council official had sharp eyes and immediately saw the problem. With one sentence, he forced the Internal Court and the Ministry of Justice's Special Department officials to the foot of the mountain. The Internal Court eunuch was silent for a moment. He could not bring out the Emperor's edict or the Ministry of Justice's wanted notice, but he could not just watch as Gao Da, a court criminal, slipped away in front of his eyes. "My identity is naturally verified by the officials of the Ministry of Justice. All the officials of the Ministry of Justice have tokens with them." The Internal Court eunuch coldly turned the matter in another direction. "If the Overwatch Council wants to stop us, they might as well kill us all." After these words were said, the entire road fell silent. A stern and cold atmosphere began to spread among the crowd. They appeared nervous, but the Internal Court eunuch's heart was calm. Presumably, the officials in the Overwatch Council carriages had already learned of Tiger Guard Gao Da's identity in the shortest amount of time possible. They knew of Gao Da's relationship with their director. Regardless of whether or not they had found out what the court wanted to do with this matter, they would not allow the internal court to capture Gouda so easily. The problem was, the internal court and Ministry of Justice had to capture Gouda and bring him back to Jingdo before the Overwatch Council sent the information to Fan Xian. They had to use force. The internal court eunuch believed that no matter how forceful the Overwatch Council was, they would not kill everyone in the mountains of the Qin Kingdom. The eunuch believed that the 30-odd carriages of the Overwatch Council had the power to kill all of them. He believed that if the Overwatch Council did not want to rebel, they would not use such ruthless methods. Thus, he walked coldly and slowly toward Gouda. The Overwatch Council official turned his body and looked at him coldly out of the corner of his eye. It was as if he was still calculating how to handle the situation before him. If this had been any other time, the official would have long thought of countless sinister ideas that would make the internal court and Ministry of Justice want to eat sh*t. However, he had suddenly encountered Gouda and suddenly heard that the court was capturing an imperial criminal. In particular, he had discovered the hidden dangers of this matter that could drag the commissioner into it. The official's emotions were agitated. For a moment he could not come up with a firm idea. No one came down from the carriage. All of the Overwatch Council officials and secret agents, including the 6th Bureau swordsman hidden in the darkness, waited for him to speak. He still did not speak until the internal court eunuch walked to Gouda's side. Right at this moment, a wave of noise suddenly broke the silence and austere atmosphere outside Dazhou City. A wave of women's laughter and noise suddenly resounded through the night sky. It was just like the stories of fox immortals told in novels. The silent long night suddenly became a paradise for people to take a stroll in. Everyone's ears perked up. They grew nervous. How could there suddenly be so many women in the middle of the night? Immediately after, these people's eyes widened. They had never thought that one night they would see so many beautiful women at the same time. Countless beautiful women in colorful dresses, beautiful as the wind, elegant figures, and all kinds of makeup surged from the back of the carriages toward the sternly scene. They seemed to not know that there was a tense atmosphere in front of them. They continued to excitedly talk about the frustrations of the journey and whose rouge was stained with dust. The road back home seemed to be quite far. After sitting in the carriage for so long, he felt a bit of a need to use the toilet. He wanted to squat in the grass, but none of the wild men in the yard were as tactful as Sir Fan Jr. They didn't even say anything about stopping. With great difficulty the group of carriages stopped, but no one came to help their hands. This carriage was quite skilled. Everyone looked at this scene dumbfounded. They all felt they had sunk into an unreal environment, particularly the officials of the Ministry of Justice at the very front. Looking at this scene, it was like they had seen a ghost. The old internal court eunuch, who had walked calmly to Gouda's side, suddenly opened his eyes wide. He abruptly stood up and looked at these beautiful women. He suddenly thought of the garden everyone in Jingdo knew about. Then he saw a pure black wheelchair being carried down from the pure black carriage. An old cripple sat in the wheelchair. His knees were covered with a wool blanket. The old cripple looked at the head eunuch and said in a raspy and slightly sharp voice, "Why have you stopped for so long? It looks like if I don't become the director, my words won't be as effective as that kid's." The internal court ace looked at Qin Pingping like he was looking at a ghost. He could not understand why this old man would suddenly appear outside Dazhou. His knees unconsciously began to tremble. His entire body and mind were taken over by a kind of terror. He knew he had made a huge mistake. He had only thought that if Sir Fan Jr. was not in the carriages, no one in the Overwatch Council would dare to directly challenge the authority the internal court represented. He had not thought that while Sir Fan Jr. was not there, the old director was in the carriages. With a thud, he knelt down and lowered his head deeply. Respectfully he said, "Greetings, Director." All of the dumbfounded officials, bailiffs and soldiers immediately guessed the old cripple's identity. The Qin Kingdom's decades of sinister power pressed down on them until they didn't dare to move. They knelt straight to the ground, including the Dazhou Jizhou. There was no exception. On both sides of the road, officials knelt on the ground toward the old cripple beside the carriage. Qin Pingping looked around with a calm expression. Suddenly, he clenched his fist and gently coughed. A strange emotion flashed through his eyes. He muttered to himself, "Yizi was right. Qiao Qiao's mother indeed gave birth to Qiao Qiao." 4 days ago the entire royal palace in Jingdo was enveloped in the faint sunlight of the end of summer and beginning of autumn. It was clear and peaceful. The Qin Kingdom was in the midst of a joyous occasion. From the emperor to the peddlers and servants, their bodies all emanated a fresh and enchanting aura from the inside out. The usually sinister royal palace seemed to have changed. The slowly moving spots of light in Taiji Palace all appeared mischievous. The only place that had not changed was the royal study. There was a heating stove in the winter and a basin of ice in the summer. It was like spring all year round. The lack of change was annoying. The master of the royal study, the Qing Kingdom's great emperor, was a terrifying figure who had remained the same for decades and had not changed at all. The people of the Ministry of Justice should have arrived in Dazhou. Find time to deal with this matter. The emperor coldly put down his teacup. The great prince had already arrived in Dongyi and had begun to deal with the rebellion in the Liang Kingdom. The secret memorials had just been sent back to Jingdo. The emperor only glanced at them briefly and then stopped caring about them. It should not be difficult for his two sons to deal with the small matters in Dongyi. Scholar, he has put in a lot of effort. Eunuch Yao looked at his nose and his nose at his heart. He said this very normally. Although his words were normal, the reality was not normal. Although He Zongwei had always wanted to have a good relationship with the heads of the eunuchs in the palace and had invested a great deal of passion and money into it, for some reason, the respect and affection the eunuchs and serving girls had for Fan Xian came from the bottom of their hearts and had never changed. Eunuch Yao's words were, without a doubt, a hidden stab at Scholar He. The Qing Emperor's expression did not change. He only laughed slightly and said, He Zongwei is also afraid of death. However, that person called Gouda has already lived for so long. I have given Enji enough face, although he does not seem to know that the traitor is still alive. Eunuch Yao suddenly said in a trembling voice, The old director will pass by Dazhou in 3 days. Your Majesty, please make a decision. Chapter 687. The mischievous speck of light ran away coolly from under the bright tiles of Taiji Palace. Passing through the heavy wooden doors of the rear palace, it ran into Hongguang Palace, burrowed into Shufang Palace, circled a few times under the slightly scarred tree, and finally hid in Guangxin Palace, which no one had lived in for a long time. Even in the slightly dry autumn wind, Guangxin Palace continued to emit a faint and bitter coldness. The white curtains in the palace had long become broken and brittle muslin. There were plum blossoms but no people. They only shone brilliantly. Even when they bloomed to the point of decay, they were still lonely. Compared to the quiet back palace, the imperial city around the front hall did not match the light atmosphere of the imperial palace. Especially inside the green stone imperial city, in the room deep under the vermilion-red palace wall, there was a solemn atmosphere. A few cold-eyed generals stood guard outside the room, but inside the room, it was unknown what they were talking about. I wonder when the great prince will return. General Gong Dian, who had resumed his position as commander of the imperial army and was in charge of the safety of the entire royal palace, stood by the person's side. There were not many people in this world who could make Gong Dian stand so obediently by his side. The person at the table was one of them. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, who had rendered meritorious service during the Jingdo Rebellion and was now appointed by the emperor to control the armies of the world, Commander Yi stroked his teacup with one hand. His eyes appeared slightly serious. He didn't speak for a long time. Brother? Perhaps this kind of silence was difficult for Gong Dian to endure. In the end he couldn't resist reminding him. Oh. Yi Zhong seemed to wake from his thoughts and replied, Director Fan Jr. will be returning to the capital in a few days. If the great prince wants to return, it will be at least the beginning of spring. He glanced at Gong Dian. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. A moment later he said in a low voice, What exactly do you want to ask? Even if the great prince returns to the capital, presumably he will immediately be transferred to Yanjing by the emperor to prepare for the northern expedition. What exactly do you want to ask? Gong Dian was silent. He and Yi Zhong were both the emperor's trusted aides. However, although the entire royal palace appeared peaceful this afternoon, there was a murderous intent hidden within it that he was not used to. He faintly guessed that this murderous intent had something to do with the major figure who had just left Jingdo not long ago. Otherwise, his senior brother would not have been overseeing matters in the Bureau of Military Affairs. Instead, he calmly waited outside the royal palace for an entire day. What are you waiting for? Asked Gong Dian. I'm waiting for His Majesty's decree. After Yi Zhong said this, he remembered that the emperor was currently making a decision. A trace of anxiety and uneasiness appeared in his eyes. With Yi Chang's status and power, there were few things in the world that could make him feel this way. He closed his eyes slowly, not wanting Gong Dian to see this. However, Gong Dian had already seen it and knew that he had guessed correctly. Inside and outside the royal palace, it appeared peaceful. In reality, undercurrents were surging. The defense level of the entire imperial army had been raised to its most tense state. Gong Dian had only accepted orders from the internal court. He didn't know what the emperor deep in the palace was guarding against. Immediately after, the imperial army received a seal from the Jingdo garrison. Only then did they know that Shi Fei had led 15,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers and spread out in a formation along the south side of Jingdo. It seemed to be a drill, but it also seemed like they were preparing for a major battle. The Bureau of Military Affairs also moved. The internal court also moved. In the streets and alleys of Jingdo, various factions began to prepare. To be able to move so much military power and arrange such a large formation within one day, it could only be the Qing Emperor alone. In the present world, there was only one person who was worthy of the emperor's serious and careful treatment and who had the power to make the emperor expend so much energy. Only that person could make Yi Zhong, the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, unable to stop his uneasiness and anxiety as he waited for the emperor's final decree. All sorts of situations interweaved together. Gong Dian finally confirmed that the emperor was going to act against Director Qin. Why? Gong Dian's throat was a bit dry. He sat down by Yi Zhong's side and raised his cup of cold tea to drink it in one gulp. However, it did not extinguish the burning fear in his heart. The imperial army protecting the palace, the movement of the garrison, and the Bureau of Military Affairs were, without question, arrangements aimed at the Overwatch Council in Jingdo. Regardless of whether it was the emperor, Commander Yi Zhong, or Gong Dian, once they thought that the person they were going to deal with was Qin Pingping, none of them had complete confidence. Only these people at the very top of the Qing kingdom knew what kind of power Qin Pingping, this skinny old cripple, had in his hands. Although he was no longer the director of the Overwatch Council, he had been the king in the darkness of the land for decades. Once he was in a dangerous situation, who knew what kind of power he would explode with? What made Gong Dian feel the most terrified, uneasy, and even faintly angry at the emperor was that he could not find any reason why the court wanted to deal with Director Qin. Was it just because his achievements shocked the emperor? This made no sense at all. If he had considered this, perhaps the emperor would have killed Qin Pingping 20 years ago. Did Qin Pingping have disloyalty? Everyone under heaven knew that Director Qin was the most loyal official at the emperor's side. If it weren't for him, the emperor would have died countless times back then. What? This was the explanation Gong Dian needed to hear the most. He began to feel that the emperor was too muddle-headed. Regardless of what the people thought of the Overwatch Council or Qin Pingping, the Overwatch Council was the emperor's special agency. Qin Pingping had always been the emperor's loyal dog. For the emperor to risk the danger of court chaos to do such an unreasonable thing, if it wasn't muddle-headed, what was it? Yi Zhong sat by the little table and was silent for a long time without saying a word. Of course, he knew why Gong Dian had lost his composure. Even though he had countless soldiers in his hands, he knew that he was dealing with Qin Pingping and the entire Overwatch Council. In the depths of his heart, he still felt a tremor and fear. Qin Pingping's reputation was too great. The things in his head were not things that normal officials could understand. Decades of history had long proven that anyone who used crafty plots and schemes to deal with Qin Pingping in the end would not meet a good end. Xiao En at his peak was one of them. The rebellions of the eldest princess and the old Qin family became a joke under the combined efforts of Director Qin and the emperor. Yi Zhong took a deep breath. There was a hint of unswerving determination in the darkness of his square face. What you need to do is to protect the safety of the royal palace. What I need to do, without question, is to stabilize the Qing kingdom's army. As for those other things, naturally, someone will do it. You must act. Otherwise, the emperor would not have summoned you here today. Gong Dian glanced at his brother disciple with a face full of worry. He didn't feel good in his heart. Back then, Qin Pingping had been able to place a 20-year spy in the old Qin family. Who knew who in the Yi family or even the most reliable Dingzhou army were Qin Pingping's people? The emperor is muddle-headed. Gong Dian thought that if the emperor truly broke off relations with Director Qin, no matter what the final outcome was, the entire Qin court would suffer irreversible damage because of this turmoil. The Overwatch Council might not rebel. Yi Zhong closed his eyes tightly and faintly said, "The emperor must have his own way of controlling the Overwatch Council." Gong Dian only shook his head. Although in his heart, the emperor was the most powerful person in the world and most worthy of loyalty and worship, Qin Pingping was, without question, the most powerful person hidden in the darkness. The Overwatch Council was not so easy to control. Immediately after, he thought of another terrifying matter. If the old director is truly captured and brought back to Jingdo, Gong Dian stared into Yi Zhong's eyes and said through gritted teeth, "What will Sir Fan Jr. do? The emperor is muddle-headed." This was the third time he had said the emperor was muddle-headed. As a loyal official, Gong Dian's reaction was indeed a bit big. However, this could not be blamed on him. Anyone who knew the true movements of the court would feel a chill from the bottom of their hearts. If this operation was targeted at Qin Pingping, it was the same as targeting the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian. Yi Zhong suddenly opened his eyes and coldly said, "He has probably just left Dongyi. Once the ship has sailed, what can he change? Even if Qin Pingping has the grace of passing on his legacy to him in the end, this is the emperor's will." As a son, would Fan Xian have the desire to avenge his father because of an old superior? Gong Dian thought about it carefully and slowly nodded his head. These two important military officials only thought that Fan Xian being able to take control of the Overwatch Council was the emperor's will and that Qin Pingping had only played the role of passing on help and guidance. They had completely not thought of Fan Xian's feelings for Qin Pingping or the story this matter involved many years ago. "Shi Fei has already brought the Jingdo garrison south," Yi Zhong slowly said. Yi Chong spoke slowly, "I only hope that this incident will cause as little commotion as possible." Impossible. Gong Dian very straightforwardly shattered Commander Ye's fantasies. They were all officials of the Qin kingdom. They all hoped that the Qin kingdom would be able to maintain stability and harmony while the present situation was good. They all hoped that the Qin kingdom could move steadily and powerfully toward its most glorious day. However, everyone knew that the battle between the emperor and Qin Pingping would certainly create a large chasm in this country. "I don't know what His Majesty is thinking." Yi Chang's expression was steely as he said word by word, "I only know that if Your Majesty wants to arrest Director Qin, the director must have done something." Gong Dian shook his head. "I don't think so. If the Qin kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sunlight, unattainable, dazzling, and ruling over the world, then the Qin kingdom's great emperor was like a god in the sun. Then Qin Pingping, who had controlled the Overwatch Council for decades, was like a king in the darkness. He had always carefully hidden behind the emperor's light and helped the emperor complete some things that were inconvenient for him to do. He helped the Qin kingdom control some things in the darkness. For decades, the Qin court had always advanced in the struggle between the civil official system and the Overwatch Council. Regardless of whether it was the powerful Prime Minister Lin Ruofu or the Hall of Governmental Affairs and Imperial Censorate later, no one could shake Qin Pingping's position in court. No one could decrease the emperor's imperial favor and trust in Qin Pingping. The officials had long gotten used to this and had already given up hope. They thought that the emperor and Qin Pingping were an anomaly between ruler and official. Perhaps they would know each other until their hair turned white and then until they died of old age. It would still be this interweaving of light and darkness. The mutual trust between ruler and official was truly a match made in heaven. That was why Gong Dian was afraid and why Yi Zhong was worried. They didn't dare to imagine how much terrifying energy would be drawn out once the light and darkness clashed. That energy was probably not something that could be resolved by a large army pressing down on a city. Shi Fei, who knew the inside story and was heading southeast of Jingdo, was the person with the heaviest heart. Like Gong Dian, he could not understand why the emperor was acting against old Director Qin. The old director had clearly resigned from all his posts and wanted to return to his hometown to retire. Why was the emperor acting now? Most importantly, why was it him? Shi Fei thought of how he was going to face Qin Pingping. Even though he was flying in the warm autumn wind, he couldn't help but shiver. He would rather face the murderous barbarians of Shihu and Shangshanhu, who used troops like a god in northern Qi, than face the old cripple who only had a few hundred people at his side and a few dozen women. He led 4,000 elite soldiers and had long arrived on a mountain not far from Dazhou. He waited nervously and helplessly for that moment to arrive. Fortunately, the emperor had never made the edict clear. He didn't need to send out troops now. He hoped he would never have to send out troops. He was waiting for the emperor to change his mind so that he could protect his own life. From the moment General Shi Fei left the city to capture Director Qin and bring him back to the capital, he already had the self-awareness to exchange his life for it. He sat on his horse and gazed back in the direction of Jingdo. His eyes narrowed slightly. He secretly prayed that the emperor's final edict would never come. Eunuch Yao stood quietly in the royal study. His trembling words earlier were just his duty as a servant. Like all of the generals, officials, and servants in the Qin kingdom, he also didn't want to see the emperor and Director Qin fall out. After Hong Xiang, Eunuch Yao, who had become the Qin court's leader, knew too much inside information. He also thought he knew why the emperor had suddenly developed such a powerful killing intent toward Director Qin. Thus, he only stood nervously and uneasily to the side, not daring to say anything. The emperor was still thinking. Earlier, a glimmer of bewilderment had involuntarily risen in his eyes. For him, whose heart was like the sky, this kind of bewilderment was an emotion that hadn't appeared in many years. Perhaps only Qin Pingping, who had accompanied him since he was a child, who had always been loyal to him, who had saved his life many times, opened mountains for the Qin kingdom, and made countless contributions, could cause him to sink into such emotions. A few thin files were placed on the table in front of him. One was the internal court's investigation into the third prince's strange assassination deep in the palace during the Jingdo rebellion. Another was the secret investigation into the Hanging Temple matter, particularly the dispute between the true head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the Shadow, and Sigu Jian in the manner of the master of the city in Dongyi this spring. The third was Fan Xian secretly sending the heavily injured Shadow to Jiangnan. The fourth was the strangeness of the Overwatch Council on the day of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley, as well as the process of when the 2 city-guarding crossbows were shipped out of the third workshop of the palace treasury. The fourth investigation file was the thickest, but the things recorded were also the most vague. The internal court had secretly investigated for a full 3 years. In front of the Overwatch Council and under Qin Pingping's purposeful concealment, the Qing Emperor had only found a hint and no concrete evidence. This file talked about the fire in Huichun Hall in Jingdo and the defection of someone in the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council. The matter pointed straight to the inner palace, the crown prince, the eldest princess, and that stormy night. There was a 5th, 6th, the 3rd prince, the 2nd prince, Qingqian Yunrui. The emperor's face was slightly pale. He picked up a thin file and placed it to the side. Then he would say a name. He threw down 4 files and said 4 names. In the end he picked up a few files. His fingers tightened slightly as he gently placed them to the side. With a sigh he said, "This is Nji." The emperor slowly raised his head. The confusion in his eyes had long disappeared. There was only a faint trace of sorrow and a self-mocking cold smile. "My most loyal official once tried to kill all of my sons. Perhaps it should be said that he forced me to kill my sons." His brows furrowed. "What surprises me the most is that this old dog didn't even let Nji go. If Nji's life had not been strong, he would probably have died to his hands long ago." The Qing Emperor slowly shook his head and took a deep breath. A cold light flashed through his eyes. Faintly he said, "Bring that old dog back. I want to ask him what exactly is going on." Eunuch Yao did not dare to say more. He bowed deeply and walked out of the royal study. His legs were about to give out because he understood the emperor's emotions better than anyone else. The emperor's last faint words were filled with too much unstoppable killing intent. As he was about to leave the royal study, the emperor suddenly said coldly, "Send a message to Yan Bingyun. Tell him I am watching him. Then send a message to Shifei. I want him alive." The emperor's expression remained cold. "If that old dog dies, he doesn't need to come back alive to see me." Chapter 688. There were many things to do this month, so I didn't write much, so I didn't have the nerve to ask for votes. Today was the last day of November, so I had to ask for votes no matter what. I hoped that everyone still had votes. I pursed my lips. Next month I will do my best to ask for votes. This is quite serious. I will write seriously and ask for votes seriously. Because regardless of whether I can finish writing Qing Yu's year next month, one thing is for sure, and that is that I will be asking for votes for the last month. I don't know what the situation will be, so I hope that everyone will leave December's votes for me. Of course, I also want today's votes. I like it very much. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.